Carl Jung, Why the Universe Waits Until You're Broken to Show You Light. There's a secret hidden in the architecture of human transformation that psychiatry has known about for over a century, but rarely speaks aloud. It's a pattern so consistent, so undeniable, that it borders on the mystical. And yet it threatens the very foundation of how we've been taught to understand mental health, spiritual growth, and the purpose of suffering itself. Carl Jung discovered this pattern during his decades of clinical work in Zurich, observing thousands of patients moving through the darkest corridors of human experience. What he found was shocking, almost heretical to speak of in medical circles. He noticed that his most profoundly transformed patients, those who didn't just recover but fundamentally metamorphosed into new beings, all shared one commonality that couldn't be explained away by diagnosis, treatment protocol, or therapeutic technique. They had been utterly broken first, not just sad, not merely anxious or struggling, broken, shattered at a depth that conventional psychology calls decompensation or nervous breakdown, clinical terms that attempt to pathologize what might actually be sacred design. These were people who had lost everything they thought defined them. Their identities dissolved. Their belief systems collapsed. Their carefully constructed lives fell apart in ways that seemed, at the time, like total catastrophe. And yet, something extraordinary happened in the aftermath. These shattered individuals didn't just heal, they transformed into something they could never have become, without first being destroyed. They emerged with a depth of wisdom, a capacity for presence, and a connection to something numinous that Jung called the self with a capital S, the divine center of the psyche that cannot be accessed while the ego remains in control. Jung observed this so consistently that he began to suspect something the medical establishment didn't want to acknowledge. What if breakdown isn't malfunction at all? What if it's not the disease but the cure? What if there's an intelligence operating in human suffering, a transpersonal wisdom that knows exactly when and how to dismantle a false life so that a true one can emerge? This is the forbidden question that haunted Jung's later work, the one that made him controversial even among his own colleagues. He was suggesting that the universe, or the collective unconscious, or whatever vast intelligence animates reality, operates on what I call the breaking principle. That wholeness requires shattering first, that death precedes rebirth not as unfortunate prerequisite, but as sacred necessity. Think about it statistically for a moment. If you were to study the biographies of mystics, artists, activists, and visionaries across history, you'd find an overwhelming correlation. Profound breakthrough follows catastrophic breakdown. The dark night of the soul precedes illumination. Ego, death opens the door to spiritual awakening. The shamanic journey requires dismemberment before the healer can be reassembled with new power. This isn't poetic metaphor. This is pattern recognition at the deepest level of human transformation. Jung himself experienced this directly. After his devastating split with Freud in 1913, he entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological disintegration so severe that he feared he was going insane. For years, he was haunted by visions, overwhelmed by archetypal forces rising from the depths of his psyche, unable to function in the way his previous self had functioned. His colleagues whispered that he'd had a psychotic break, but Jung did something radical. Instead of pathologizing his breakdown, he engaged with it. He recorded his visions in what would become the Red Book, dialoguing with the figures that emerged from his unconscious. He allowed himself to be broken open rather than trying to glue himself back together according to his old design. And what emerged from those years of darkness was the foundation of analytical psychology, ideas about the collective unconscious, archetypes, individuation, and the self that would revolutionize how we understand human consciousness. Jung's breakdown was the birth canal of his life's work. Without it, he would have remained Freud's brilliant protege, never discovering the depths that made him Jung. Now, here's where this gets personal, where this moves from historical curiosity to something that might explain the inexplicable in your own life. If you're watching this video, there's a high probability that you've been broken. Maybe you're in the midst of it right now. Relationships ending, career collapsing, health failing, or that more subtle but equally devastating breaking, where everything looks fine on the outside, but inside you feel like you're dissolving into nothing. Or maybe you've already been through it and you're on the other side, but you still carry the question, why? Why did that have to happen? Why with such devastating precision? Why did it feel like the universe itself was dismantling me piece by piece? What if I told you that your breaking wasn't random? What if the catastrophes that shattered you were precisely calibrated interventions designed to destroy the false version of you so that the true version could finally emerge? What if suffering isn't punishment but signal? A communication from the depths of your own being telling you that you've wandered too far from your essential nature and the only way back is through total collapse of the structure you've mistaken for yourself. This is what Jung discovered in the pattern. The universe waits until you're broken because only breaking creates the conditions necessary for genuine transformation. Your ego, the conscious personality you believe is you, is too defended, too committed to its own survival, too identified with its persona and roles, to ever voluntarily surrender. It will make incremental improvements, yes. It will self-optimize and self-help and personal develop itself into a more polished version of the same fundamental structure, but it will never die. And transformation requires death, not physical death, but psychological death, ego death, the death of who you thought you were so that who you actually are can be born. And the ego, by its very nature, will never volunteer for this. It must be forcibly broken open by circumstances it cannot control, by losses it cannot prevent, by a darkness so total that all its usual coping mechanisms fail. This is the intelligence of catastrophe. Your breakdowns are not evidence of your weakness or failure. They are evidence that something in you wiser than your conscious mind knows you've outgrown your current form, and that form must be shattered before you can expand into what you're meant to become. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And acceptance of this depth, the kind that leads to individuation, to becoming whole, can only happen when the false self has been broken beyond repair. When there's nothing left to defend, nothing left to preserve, nothing left but the raw, undefended truth of what you are beneath all the conditioning and persona and adaptation to others' expectations. So if you've been broken and you don't know why, if you feel like your life was deliberately dismantled by forces beyond your control, if you've experienced the bewildering sense that the universe itself conspired against your happiness, stay with me. Because what I'm about to show you is that your breaking was not an accident. It was an initiation. And hidden in the wreckage of your old life is the blueprint for your new one. The universe doesn't break you carelessly. It breaks you with surgical precision, dismantling exactly what needs to be destroyed so that exactly what needs to emerge can finally come forth. Your suffering has been speaking a language you weren't taught to understand. Your darkness has been preparing you for a light you couldn't have received in any other way. This is the forbidden pattern Jung discovered. This is the architecture of transformation that changes everything once you see it. And by the end of this journey together, you will see your breaking, not as your tragedy, but as your terrible, beautiful, necessary becoming. The universe waits until you're broken to show you light, because an unbroken container cannot receive what's trying to be born through you, and what's trying to be born through you is too vast, too authentic, too powerful to fit into the small, defended, carefully controlled self you used to be. Your breaking wasn't the end of your story, it was the beginning of your true one. Before we can understand why breaking is necessary, we need to understand what gets broken, and Jung was precise about this. It's not you that breaks, it's the ego, that small surface self that you've spent your entire life building, defending, and mistaking for your essential identity. The ego is both your protector and your prison, and it will never voluntarily open the door. Let me be clear about what Jung meant by ego, because this term has been corrupted by pop psychology. The ego isn't inherently bad or something to be destroyed. It's the conscious personality, the sense of I, that navigates everyday reality, makes decisions, interacts with others, and maintains a coherent sense of identity across time. You need an ego to function. Without it, you're psychotic, unable to distinguish self from other, inner from outer, fantasy from reality. But here's the problem. The ego doesn't know it's just one part of the psyche. It believes it's the whole thing. It thinks it's in charge. And more dangerously, it becomes convinced that its primary purpose is not to serve the totality of who you are, but to maintain its own control, comfort, and survival at all costs. The ego is a control center that becomes a control freak. Think about how much of your life is organized around control. You plan to control the future. You predict to control uncertainty. You protect to control vulnerability. You perform to control how others perceive you. You accumulate wealth to control security. You perfect your appearance to control attraction. You develop expertise to control your value. You maintain relationships to control belonging. You build routines to control chaos. And for a while, this works. The ego constructs elaborate systems, psychological, social, financial, emotional, that create the illusion that you are in charge of your life. That if you just plan well enough, work hard enough, stay vigilant enough, you can prevent catastrophe and ensure your happiness. The ego's unspoken promise is this: stay in control and you'll stay safe. But this promise is a lie, and eventually, life presents you with a bill you cannot pay, a loss you cannot prevent, a chaos you cannot contain. And when that happens, the ego's entire operating system fails. All its strategies prove impotent. All its defenses collapse. And you, the conscious you who believed you were running the show, suddenly realize you were never really in control of anything at all. Let me tell you about Michael. His story illustrates the pattern with devastating clarity. Michael was a 42-year-old entrepreneur who had built his life into a fortress of control. He ran a successful tech company that he'd grown from nothing through sheer force of will and 18-hour workdays. He was married with 2 kids, lived in a beautiful home, maintained an impressive physique through obsessive fitness routines, and projected an image of someone who had life figured out. He was the friend everyone went to for advice because Michael always had a plan, always had an answer, always seemed 3 steps ahead. What no one knew, what Michael himself barely admitted, was that his entire existence was held together by relentless control. He micromanaged every aspect of his business because he couldn't trust anyone to maintain his standards. He scheduled his marriage like board meetings because spontaneity felt like chaos. He controlled his children's activities down to 15-minute increments because their success felt like his responsibility. He suppressed his emotions because feelings were variables that couldn't be predicted or managed. Michael's ego had built an empire, and empires fall. The first crack appeared when his business partner, his childhood best friend, embezzled money and left the company on the verge of bankruptcy. Michael couldn't understand it. He'd controlled for every possible risk, except betrayal by someone he'd trusted completely. The legal battles consumed him. The financial hemorrhaging accelerated. Within 6 months, the company he'd spent 15 years building collapsed. While he was navigating that catastrophe, his wife told him she'd been unhappy for years and wanted a divorce. She said she felt like she was married to a project manager, not a person. That he'd been so busy controlling everything that he'd never actually been present with her. Michael was blindsided. He'd thought his relentless provision was love. He'd thought his careful planning of family vacations and financial security was intimacy. He was wrong. Then his body betrayed him. In the middle of the divorce proceedings and bankruptcy hearings, Michael had what he first thought was a heart attack. It wasn't. It was a massive panic attack followed by a diagnosis of stress-induced hypertension and early signs of autoimmune dysfunction. His doctor told him his body was attacking itself. Business collapse, marriage ending, health crisis, all within the same year. Michael described it to me as being systematically dismantled by the universe. Every structure he'd built, every form of control he'd relied on, every defense that had made him feel safe, all of it was stripped away simultaneously. He lost his company, his marriage, his health, his sense of identity, and his belief that he could control his life. What Michael experienced, what Jung would call a confrontation with the self, was not 3 separate catastrophes. It was one unified intervention. The universe wasn't punishing Michael. It was breaking him open because he had become so identified with his ego's control systems that he could no longer access his essential nature. He was suffocating inside a fortress of his own design, and the only way to liberate him was to demolish the fortress entirely. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." Michael's ego had been oppressing him for decades with its tyrannical demand for control, and transformation could not happen through gradual adjustment or therapeutic insight. The ego is too clever for that. It can incorporate self-help strategies and psychological understanding into its control system without actually surrendering anything fundamental. No, transformation required what Michael experienced: total system failure. The ego exhausted beyond its capacity to rebuild. The illusion of control shattered beyond repair, and in that devastation, a question finally became possible that couldn't be asked before. Who am I without all of this? This is the question the universe has been trying to get you to ask. But the ego will never ask it voluntarily because the answer threatens its existence. The ego's entire purpose is to maintain a stable sense of self, to protect continuity of identity, to preserve the story of who you are. And if who you are is fundamentally false, an adaptation, a persona, a defense mechanism against your authentic nature, then the ego's very success becomes your spiritual failure. You remain safe but small, defended but dead, controlled but never truly alive. Jung observed that most people come to therapy not because they want to change, but because they want to feel better while staying exactly the same. They want the therapist to help them rebuild their ego's defenses more effectively. They want strategies to regain control. They want their lives to work the way they used to work before the breakdown began. But Jung's approach was different. He saw the breakdown as the psyche's wisdom, not its pathology. He understood that the unconscious orchestrates crises when the ego has become too rigid, too defended, too far removed from the self. The symptoms that bring someone into therapy, the depression, the anxiety, the panic, the meaninglessness, these are not problems to be eliminated. They are signals that something essential is trying to break through, and the ego's defenses are finally cracking. The universe waits for ego exhaustion because the psyche cannot transform what it can still protect. As long as you have energy left to maintain your defenses, to preserve your control systems, to keep the fortress intact, you will do exactly that. Transformation requires a level of surrender that only happens when you've completely exhausted your capacity to hold it all together. This is why gradual change doesn't work for people who are ego-identified. You can read every self-help book, attend every workshop, practice every technique, and remain fundamentally unchanged because your ego is using all those tools to become a better defended version of the same structure. You become a more enlightened ego, a more conscious ego, a more spiritual ego, but still an ego in control. The breaking principle operates differently. It doesn't give you tools to improve your defense system. It demolishes the defense system entirely so that what's defending itself can finally be seen and released. Think of it like this. If you're trapped in a burning building, incremental progress toward the exit isn't enough. You can learn to breathe more efficiently in the smoke, develop better coping strategies for the heat, practice positive affirmations about surviving fire. But you're still in a burning building. Sometimes the only path to safety is for the entire structure to collapse, so you're forced out of it entirely. This is what happened to Michael. His fortress had to burn to the ground because he would never have walked out of it voluntarily. And the universe knew this, something deeper than his conscious mind, what Jung called the self, what some might call soul or higher wisdom or God, knew that Michael's false life had to be destroyed for his true life to become possible. The fortress problem is universal. We all build them. We construct elaborate systems of control to protect ourselves from vulnerability, uncertainty, and the terror of not knowing who we are beneath our identities. And these fortresses work for a while. They keep us safe. But eventually, safety becomes stagnation, protection becomes prison, and the very structures we built to preserve ourselves become the walls that prevent our expansion. The universe's forced surrender protocol activates when the gap between who you truly are and who you're pretending to be becomes unbearable for your soul to sustain, not unbearable for your conscious mind that can tolerate enormous levels of inauthenticity, unbearable for your essential nature, for the self that is trying to individuate through you, for the life force that refuses to be contained in too small forms. And when that protocol activates, everything you've been controlling starts to slip through your fingers, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're ready, at a level deeper than consciousness, for something real. Michael sat in his empty apartment 6 months after his world collapsed and told me something that captures the essence of this chapter perfectly. He said, "I spent 20 years building a life I thought would make me happy, and it took everything falling apart for me to realize I'd been building a prison. I'm terrified of what comes next, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I might actually find out who I really am. That's the gift hidden in the breaking. The illusion of control dies, and with it dies the false self that was sustained by that illusion. What remains is raw, undefended, uncertain, but finally real, finally available for authentic transformation, finally open to what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you've been pretending to be. The ego doesn't die permanently, it reconstitutes. But after a genuine breaking, it reconstitutes differently. It no longer believes it's the master. It becomes the servant of something larger, something wiser, something it was always meant to serve. The self, the totality of your being, the divine spark that seeks its own realization through your unique life. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." And acceptance of this depth only becomes possible when every alternative has been exhausted, when you've tried everything to maintain control and every strategy has failed, when you've hit bottom so completely that the only direction left is surrender. The universe waits until you're broken not because it's cruel, but because your ego is so powerfully committed to its own survival that only breaking creates the conditions for genuine surrender. And surrender, the kind that leads to transformation, is not something you do. It's what happens when you've finally exhausted every option except the truth. Michael's fortress fell, and in the rubble, he found something he'd been too defended to discover before, himself. Not the performed self, not the controlled self, not the self that had all the answers. The real self. Vulnerable, uncertain, alive. That's what's waiting on the other side of your breaking too. Not the improved version of your ego. The death of the ego's tyranny and the birth of something vastly more authentic. But first, the fortress must fall. And the universe, in its terrible compassion, will provide exactly the demolition necessary. Now we enter territory that makes Western consciousness profoundly uncomfortable. We're going to talk about destruction not as tragedy to be avoided, but as sacred principle to be honored. About the divine feminine force that breaks what needs to be broken, that destroys what has outlived its purpose, that tears down structures so that new life can emerge from the ruins. Jung encountered this force directly during his own breakdown, and it terrified him. In his visions recorded in the Red Book, he met a figure named Salome, a beautiful but dangerous feminine presence accompanied by the blind prophet Elijah. Salome represented the dark goddess archetype, the destructive aspect of the feminine principle that patriarchal religions have demonized and fear. She wasn't the nurturing mother or the pure virgin. She was the destroyer, the one who dances with death, the feminine power that breaks what the masculine wants to preserve. Jung realized that Salome embodied something essential that had been exiled from Western consciousness, the understanding that destruction is as sacred as creation, that death is as holy as birth, that what tears down is as necessary as what builds up. In his dialogue with these archetypal forces, Jung came to understand that the psyche cannot heal without first being broken open by what he called the terrible mother. Not terrible as in evil, but terrible as in awesome, overwhelming, beyond the ego's capacity to control or domesticate. Let's get specific about this archetype because it appears across every wisdom tradition, always carrying the same essential message. True transformation requires sacred destruction. In Hinduism, she is Kali, the black goddess adorned with skulls and severed heads, dancing on corpses, tongue extended, dripping blood. She is the destroyer of illusion, the force that dismantles ego, the power that kills what must die so that reality can be seen clearly. Her devotees don't pray to her for comfort. They pray to her for liberation through annihilation of the false self. In Greek mythology, she is Hecate, goddess of the crossroads, of thresholds, of the dark moon, when nothing is visible and everything is in transition. She presides over the underworld, over death and rebirth, over the liminal spaces where one identity dies and another has not yet been born. She is invoked not for success, but for passage through what cannot be bypassed. In Mesopotamian myth, she is Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, who forces her sister Inanna to descend, to be stripped of all adornments, to be hung on a meat hook to rot. Ereshkigal represents the part of the psyche that refuses to let you bypass death. She is the guardian of the darkness you must pass through, the force that will not allow false transcendence or premature resurrection. In Celtic tradition, she is the Morrigan, the phantom queen who appears as crow or raven, who presides over battlefields where heroes die, who brings the death that makes space for new sovereignty. She doesn't prevent necessary destruction, she consecrates it, and in Jungian terms, she is the terrible aspect of the great mother archetype, not the mother who nurtures and protects, but the mother who devours her children when it's time, for them to die to childhood and be born as adults. She is nature's own intelligence, the forest fire that seems catastrophic but creates conditions for regeneration, the winter that kills what cannot survive so spring can bring forth new life, the pain that forces change when comfort would allow stagnation. This is the archetype that activates during your breaking, and Western consciousness, particularly modern Western consciousness, shaped by patriarchal monotheism and rational materialism, has taught you to fear her, to see her only as enemy, to experience destruction only as tragedy. But indigenous wisdom traditions understood something we've forgotten. Initiation requires death. The child must die for the adult to be born. The adolescent must die for the mature human to emerge. The uninitiated must die for the initiated to arise. And this death is not metaphorical. It is psychologically real, emotionally devastating, spiritually transformative. It is a death of identity, of worldview, of self-concept, so total that what emerges on the other side is not the same person who entered the ordeal. This is why indigenous cultures created rites of passage, controlled breaking experiences that inducted young people into adulthood through confrontation with death, endurance of pain, separation from childhood identity, and ritual rebirth as a new being. Vision quests, walkabouts, isolation ordeals, scarification, fasting until vision comes. These were not primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated technologies for facilitating the death of one identity and the birth of another. Modern Western culture has lost these rites. We have no sanctioned pathways for psychological death and rebirth, no elders to guide initiatory ordeal, no rituals that honor the necessity of destruction, and so the psyche creates its own initiation through crisis, through breakdown, through the catastrophes that force us to die to who we were and discover who we're becoming. Jung understood this when he wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. The chaos of your breaking is not random, it is cosmically ordered destruction. It is the dark goddess doing her sacred work of tearing down what needs to be torn down so that what's trying to emerge can finally come forth." Let me give you the metaphor that makes this viscerally clear. The forest fire. Imagine an old-growth forest that hasn't burned in 100 years. On the surface, it looks healthy, thriving even, but beneath the canopy, the forest floor is choked with dead wood, dried brush, and organic matter that accumulates faster than it can decompose. The ecosystem becomes stagnant. New growth is strangled by old debris. Seeds cannot reach soil. Light cannot reach ground. The forest appears alive, but has actually become a kind of tomb for its own potential. Then lightning strikes, fire erupts, and to the superficial observer, this looks like catastrophe. The forest is being destroyed, the trees consumed, the animals fleeing. It looks like death, like loss, like tragedy, but ecologists know something different. They know that certain species, sequoias, jack pines, lodgepole pines, require fire to reproduce. Their cones only open and release seeds in extreme heat. The fire that appears to destroy the forest is actually triggering the next generation of growth. More than that, the fire clears the deadwood, returns nutrients to the soil, opens the canopy to let light reach the ground, and creates the exact conditions necessary for renewal. Without fire, the forest dies slowly, choked by its own accumulated past. With fire, the forest experiences death and rebirth, becoming more diverse, more resilient, more alive than it was before the flames. Your breaking is the forest fire, and the dark goddess is the lightning strike. What looks like destruction from the perspective of your ego is actually liberation from the perspective of your soul. What feels like catastrophe to your conscious mind is actually consecration by your deeper wisdom. The fire isn't punishing you, It's clearing the deadwood of false identity, outdated beliefs, exhausted patterns, accumulated trauma, and defensive strategies that once served you but now strangle your growth. And here's the crucial reframe that changes everything. Destruction is how the universe loves us. I know that sounds insane to a mind trained to see love only as comfort, support, validation, and protection. But that is conditional love. The love that says, I will love you as long as you remain who I want you to be. The love of the dark goddess is unconditional in a terrifying way. I love you too much to let you remain small, defended, false, or less than what you're capable of becoming. And if that means destroying everything you've built that keeps you from your essence, I will destroy it. This is fierce love, liberating love, the love that will burn down your prison even if you're screaming that it's your home. Jung experienced this during his confrontation with the unconscious, when archetypal forces rose up from the depths and shattered his rational mind's dominance. He wrote about feeling like he was being torn apart, like he was going mad, like he was losing himself. And he was. The self he'd been, Freud's brilliant protege, the controlled scientist, the rational mind, that self was being destroyed by forces that cared nothing for his ego's survival and everything for his soul's evolution. Salome, the dangerous feminine presence in his visions, represented this destructive wisdom. She was beautiful and terrible, seductive and deadly, the force that lures you into destruction, that reveals itself as initiation only in hindsight. Jung initially resisted her, feared her, tried to maintain his ego's control. But eventually he learned to surrender to her dance, to let her destroy what needed destroying, to trust that what seemed like chaos was actually cosmos, secret order hidden in apparent disorder. This is the lesson of the dark goddess for your breaking. What's destroying you is also delivering you. What's tearing you apart is also setting you free. What's killing your false self is also birthing your true self. But you cannot see this while you're in the fire. All you can feel is the burning, and this is precisely why the dark goddess has been demonized by patriarchal consciousness. The masculine principle, not maleness but the archetypal masculine, wants to build, preserve, control, maintain, protect. It fears dissolution, chaos, loss of structure, uncertainty. It sees destruction only as enemy to be conquered, never as ally to be honored. So the dark goddess, the principle of necessary destruction, gets recast as evil. She becomes the witch, the demon, the dangerous woman, the chaos that must be controlled, the darkness that must be illuminated, the death that must be defeated. Her sacred function is forgotten, and we're left with a culture that sees all breaking as pathology, all destruction as tragedy, all death as failure. But the psyche knows better. Your soul knows better. And when the gap between your authentic self and your adapted self becomes unbearable, the dark goddess activates within you, not to punish you, to liberate you, not to harm you, to transform you, not to end your story, to end the false story so the true story can finally begin. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," and the dark goddess is the personified principle of that necessary pain. She is the midwife of consciousness, whose methods are not gentle but are absolutely effective. She breaks the water, cuts the cord, forces the passage from one state of being to another. She doesn't comfort you through transformation. She is the transformation itself. If you're in the midst of breaking right now, if you feel like destructive forces beyond your control are tearing your life apart, I want you to consider the possibility that you're not being randomly victimized. You're being initiated. The dark goddess, whether you conceptualize her as divine force, archetypal pattern, or the wisdom of your own unconscious, has recognized that your soul has outgrown its current form and that form must be destroyed for your evolution to continue. This doesn't make the pain less real. Fire burns whether it's consecrated or not, but it reframes your breaking from meaningless suffering into sacred ordeal, from punishment into initiation, from tragedy into transformative passage. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop resisting the destruction, the moment you surrender to the dark goddess's dance, the moment you trust that what's being torn down has outlived its purpose, that's when the fire stops being torture and starts being purification. Not because the flames are less hot, but because you're no longer fighting the very force that's trying to set you free. The forest doesn't resist the fire, it burns. And in burning, it becomes fertile ground for what comes next. This is the wisdom of destruction as sacred principle. This is the dark goddess's gift hidden in your breaking. You're not being destroyed randomly. You're being initiated intentionally. And the force doing the destroying loves you more fiercely than anything that's ever tried to keep you comfortable in your small, defended, false life. Let her burn what needs burning. Trust the fire, honor the destruction. You're not dying, you're being born. Now we arrive at one of Jung's most radical insights, the concept that fundamentally changed how depth psychology understands human suffering. It's a principle so powerful that once you see it, you'll recognize its operation everywhere in your own life and in the collective disasters playing out across history. The shadow, and not just what it is, but what it does when you refuse to acknowledge it. Jung defined the shadow as everything about yourself that you've rejected, denied, repressed, or disowned. It's the repository of all the qualities, impulses, desires, and aspects of your being that didn't fit the image you needed to present to the world, or that contradicted the idealized self-concept your ego constructed. The shadow is not inherently negative. It contains your unlived potential just as much as your destructive impulses, but it exists in darkness because you've forced it there, exiled it to the unconscious because acknowledging it would threaten your ego's carefully maintained identity. And here's where Jung's insight becomes devastating. The shadow doesn't just sit quietly in the dark, accepting its exile. It accumulates power. It grows stronger in proportion to how vigorously you deny it. And eventually, when it's been rejected long enough, when it's become strong enough, it stops asking for integration and instead engineers your destruction, not to harm you, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to force recognition of what you've been refusing to include in your conscious identity. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. And the reason it's disagreeable is that making your shadow conscious requires admitting that you are not who you've been pretending to be. It requires seeing that the parts of yourself you've condemned in others actually live within you. It requires owning the very qualities you've built your identity around rejecting. The shadow is your unlived life, and your breaking is often the shadow's extreme measure to get your attention when all subtler attempts have failed. Let me tell you about Sarah because her story illustrates this mechanism with painful clarity. Sarah was a spiritual teacher in her early 40s, renowned in wellness circles for her teachings on divine feminine energy, sacred sexuality as path to enlightenment, and tantric practices for transcending ego. She led workshops, had a popular YouTube channel, and positioned herself as someone who had transmuted sexual energy into spiritual power. Her brand was purity through transcendence. She taught others how to move beyond base desires into higher consciousness. Behind this carefully curated image was a shadow that Sarah had been denying for 20 years. Sarah had been raised in a fundamentalist religious household where sexuality was shameful, bodies were sinful, and desire was evidence of moral weakness. As a teenager, she was sexually curious, attracted to multiple people, hungry for embodied experience, but every impulse was met with condemnation, so she learned to split herself. The good Sarah was pure, spiritual, controlled. The bad Sarah, the one with sexual desire, bodily hunger, unruly attraction, got locked in the basement of her psyche. When she discovered Tantra in her 20s, she thought she'd found the solution. She could be sexual but make it spiritual. She could have desire but transcend it. She could engage the body but remain above it. Her sexuality became spiritualized, performative, carefully controlled within the framework of sacred practice. She never let herself just want someone without cosmic justification. She never admitted that sometimes she wanted raw, unspiritual, messy human connection. For 2 decades, her shadow accumulated in the basement. All the denied desire, all the suppressed wildness, all the hunger for connection that wasn't wrapped in spiritual ceremony, all the parts of her sexuality that were just human, not divine. All the simple want that didn't need enlightenment as excuse. The shadow tried to communicate through dreams, vivid sexual dreams that disturbed her, that she interpreted as lower energies to be transcended. It tried to speak through her body, chronic pelvic pain that no doctor could explain, that she treated with more spiritual practice rather than listening to what it might be saying. It tried to signal through her increasing rigidity, the way her teachings became more absolute, her judgments of unawakened sexuality harsher, her persona more tightly controlled. But Sarah didn't listen. She doubled down on her spiritual identity, convinced that any crack in her transcendent persona would mean falling back into the shame of her childhood. She became what Jung called mana personality, someone inflated with archetypal power, identified with the wise teacher archetype, believing herself beyond the human struggles of ordinary people. Then the shadow took revenge. Sarah began an affair with one of her students, a married man half her age. It started as sacred exploration, but quickly became raw, obsessive, uncontained desire. She told herself it was tantric initiation. Her shadow knew better. This was everything she'd denied erupting with volcanic force. The affair was discovered when explicit messages were leaked to her online community. The man's wife publicly exposed the relationship. Sarah's carefully constructed spiritual image imploded overnight. Her YouTube channel hemorrhaged subscribers. Her workshops were canceled. Former students wrote exposés about her hypocrisy. The spiritual community she'd been central to expelled her. Her reputation, the thing she'd built her entire adult life around, was destroyed. And in the wreckage, Sarah finally had to face what she'd been denying. She was human, messy, contradictory, driven by desires she couldn't transcend, hungry for connection she couldn't spiritualize, sexual in ways that had nothing to do with enlightenment. Her shadow hadn't wanted to destroy her. It wanted to be included in her. But she'd rejected it so completely for so long that the only way it could force recognition was through catastrophic eruption. This is the pattern Jung identified. What you refuse to integrate eventually becomes your destroyer. Not because the shadow is malicious, but because the psyche demands wholeness. The parts of you that you exile don't disappear. They gather strength in the unconscious until they're powerful enough to break through your defenses and force themselves into consciousness, usually through the very thing you've been most trying to prevent. The narcissist who has rejected their vulnerability projects it onto others until someone finally wounds them so deeply they can't maintain the false self anymore. The intellectual who has denied their emotions develops a depression so severe that rational analysis becomes impossible. The people-pleaser who has suppressed their anger eventually explodes in rage that destroys their most important relationships. The control addict who has rejected uncertainty faces chaos they cannot manage. Your shadow studies you. It knows exactly where you're defended. It knows precisely what you've built your identity around being or not being, and it engineers your breaking in the exact area of your greatest denial. Jung understood this from his own experience. After splitting with Freud, Jung's shadow material, all the non-rational, mythological, mystical content he'd been trying to make acceptable to Freud's scientific framework, erupted with overwhelming force. The visions, the archetypal figures, the numinous experiences he'd been trying to contain within rational psychology burst through and nearly destroyed his sanity. But it was this eruption that led to his most profound work, because he finally stopped trying to be only the rational scientist and allowed the mystic, the visionary, the artist within him to be integrated. The shadow doesn't want to harm you. It wants to complete you. It wants to make you whole by forcing recognition of what you've fragmented. But because you've identified so strongly with not being what the shadow contains, this completion feels like destruction. Sarah's shadow wasn't trying to ruin her reputation. It was trying to liberate her from a false identity that required her to be superhuman. The affair, the scandal, the public humiliation, these were the extreme measures necessary to break the spiritual persona that had become her prison. In destroying her image as the pure teacher, her shadow was actually trying to give her back her humanity. And here's where shadow work intersects with the breaking principle. Your breakdown often reveals what was being denied. There's a forensic quality to it. If you trace your catastrophe back, if you ask what part of yourself was being exiled, you'll discover that your breaking is actually showing you the shape of your wholeness. Let me give you what I call shadow archaeology. 6 questions to trace your breaking back to denied parts. First, what quality or behavior do I judge most harshly in other people? This is almost always shadow material. We have the strongest reactions to traits in others that we've forbidden in ourselves. Sarah judged unspiritual sexuality harshly because her own earthy sexuality was exiled in her shadow. Second, what was I most afraid of becoming? The shadow often manifests as exactly the thing you've structured your entire identity around not being. If you've built your life around being responsible, your shadow might erupt as recklessness. If you've identified as the strong one, your shadow might force breakdown that reveals your vulnerability. Third, what keeps appearing in my life despite my best efforts to avoid it? Recurring patterns, especially ones you hate, often signal shadow content seeking integration. If chaos keeps disrupting your controlled life, chaos might be the shadow quality you need to incorporate, not eliminate. Fourth, what was I taught was unacceptable in my family or culture? Shadow formation begins early, as we learn which parts of ourselves must be hidden to receive love and belonging. Your breaking often reconnects you with the authentic self that was exiled in childhood. Fifth, what do I secretly admire in others but never allow myself to express? The shadow contains positive qualities too: creativity, spontaneity, vulnerability, whatever you've decided is too dangerous to embody. Your catastrophe might be forcing you to finally claim these gifts. Sixth, what aspect of my life broke first? And what does that reveal about what I was over-controlling? The area that collapsed, career, relationship, health, reputation, usually points to where your shadow was most actively denied. Michael's business collapse revealed his control shadow. Sarah's scandal revealed her sexuality shadow. This is shadow archaeology. Not to blame yourself for your breaking, but to understand its intelligence. To see that what destroyed your false self was actually trying to deliver your true self. Jung wrote that the shadow seeks integration, not victory. It doesn't want to replace your conscious personality. It wants to be included in it. But when you refuse integration, when you keep exiling parts of yourself to maintain an idealized self-image, The shadow has only one option left: forced entry through catastrophic eruption. Your breaking isn't random. It's the return of the exiled. It's the uprising of denied life demanding to be lived. It's your shadow saying, "You will acknowledge me, even if I have to destroy everything you've built to get your attention." And the terrible beauty of this is that once you understand it, once you recognize your catastrophe as shadow communication rather than random punishment, everything changes. Your breaking becomes a message you can learn to read. Your destroyer becomes your guide to wholeness. Sarah, 18 months after her scandal, told me something that captures this perfectly. She said, "I spent 20 years teaching people how to be spiritual, and it took losing everything to discover I didn't know how to be human. My shadow didn't destroy me. It saved me from a life of performing transcendence instead of living authenticity." That's the gift hidden in the shadow's revenge. What seems like destruction is actually liberation. What feels like your worst self revealing itself is actually your whole self trying to emerge. What looks like catastrophe is actually the psyche's wisdom, forcing you to integrate what you've been denying. The parts of you that you've locked in the basement are coming upstairs. And yes, they're breaking down the door, making a mess, disrupting everything. But they're not intruders. They're parts of you that you exiled, and they're finally coming home. Jung's invitation was radical. Stop fighting the shadow. Stop trying to eliminate it, transcend it, or keep it contained. Instead, turn toward it. Dialogue with it. Ask it what it wants. Listen to what your breaking is revealing about what you've been denying, because the shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to make you whole. And sometimes wholeness requires the breaking of the partial, defended, idealized self you've been pretending to be. Your catastrophe is your shadow's extreme measure, not to punish you for rejecting it, but to finally, desperately force recognition of what you've been refusing to see. And once you see it, once you acknowledge it, once you begin to integrate it, the destruction stops being revenge and starts being reunion. The parts of you that seemed like enemies reveal themselves as allies, and the breaking that felt like the end reveals itself as the beginning of finally becoming whole. We need to talk about what actually happens during the breaking, not the conceptual understanding, not the metaphysical meaning, but the visceral, terrifying, disorienting experience of psychological dismemberment. Because if you're in this stage right now, you need to know that what feels like you're going insane is actually a recognizable process that others have survived and emerged from, transformed. Jung studied alchemy extensively, not because he believed in turning lead into gold, but because he recognized that alchemical texts were encoded descriptions of psychological transformation. The alchemists were describing in symbolic language the stages the psyche moves through during profound metamorphosis. And the two stages most relevant to understanding your breaking are what the alchemists called nigredo, the blackening, and mortificatio, the death process. Nigredo is the stage of decomposition, of breaking down, of everything turning dark and formless. It's the rot that precedes rebirth. In psychological terms, it's when your identity begins to dissolve, when meaning collapses, when the structures that organized your sense of self begin to fall apart. Nothing makes sense anymore. The future disappears. The past feels like it belonged to someone else. You're trapped in an eternal present of suffering that feels like it will never end. Mortificatio goes even deeper. It's the death stage, the simulation of mortality at a psychological level. It's when you feel like you're dying, even though your body is still functioning, when some essential part of you is being killed and you're powerless to prevent it. When you experience ego death, the dissolution of the conscious personality that believed it was in control and in charge of your life. Let me describe what this actually feels like. because naming the experience gives you something to hold on to when you're in the middle of it. First dimension, identity dissolution. You lose your sense of who you are. The roles that defined you, partner, parent, professional, whatever identity you built your life around, stop feeling real. You look at yourself in the mirror and feel like you're looking at a stranger. The story you've been telling about who you are falls apart. People ask you questions like, "What do you want?" or "What are you going to do?" And you realize you have no idea. The person who would have answered those questions doesn't exist anymore. Jessica described it like this: I was a mother, a wife, a teacher. Those weren't just what I did, they were who I was. When my marriage ended and my kids went to college and I went on medical leave from teaching all in the same year, I felt like I'd been erased. I would wake up and literally not know who I was. Not in a philosophical way, in a terrifying, concrete way, like someone had deleted the operating system and I was just empty hardware. Second dimension, meaning collapse. Everything that gave your life purpose or significance suddenly feels hollow, arbitrary, or absurd. Career achievements that once mattered feel meaningless. Relationships that once felt important feel like performances. Beliefs that once provided comfort feel like lies you told yourself. The grand narrative that made sense of your life, whatever story about progress or purpose or destiny you'd been following, reveals itself as fiction. Marcus, a former military officer, described it. I spent 20 years serving my country, believing I was part of something larger than myself, that my sacrifices meant something. Then I came home, and it was like a switch flipped. I couldn't find the meaning anymore. I'd watch the news and see us still at war and think, what was any of it for? I couldn't access the beliefs that had sustained me. It was like meaning itself had been surgically removed from my brain. This is the Negredo. Everything turns to ash. Nothing holds significance. The world doesn't become sad. It becomes gray, flat, emptied of the quality that makes anything matter. Third dimension, loss of reference points. You lose your ability to orient yourself in reality. The future which you used to plan for and work toward becomes opaque, unimaginable. You can't see a path forward because all paths require a self to walk them, and you're not sure who that self is anymore. The past, which used to provide continuity of identity, feels disconnected from you. You look back at who you were 6 months or a year ago and cannot bridge the gap to who you are now. Time itself distorts. The present moment stretches into eternity. Hours feel like days. Days feel like forever. You lose the sense of progression, of life moving forward. You're stuck in a perpetual now of disintegration, unable to remember a time when you felt normal and unable to imagine a time when you'll feel normal again. Sarah, whom we talked about earlier, described this. After my scandal broke, I lost all sense of time. Every day was the same day, the day my life ended. I couldn't remember what it felt like to wake up as the person I used to be, and I couldn't imagine a future where I was anyone else. It was like being trapped in a single moment of destruction that kept repeating forever. Fourth dimension, the dissolution of timeline. Past, present, and future collapse into a single eternal moment of suffering. You lose your biographical continuity, the story of your life, the narrative arc that connected who you were, who you are, and who you were becoming, shatters. You exist in fragments. Memory becomes unreliable. Future becomes impossible. All you have is this moment, this pain, this sense of everything falling apart. This is mortificatio. This is psychological death. This is what it feels like when the ego, the conscious personality that organized your experience, begins to die. And here's what you need to understand. This is not psychosis. This is not permanent insanity. This is a recognized stage of transformation that has been described across mystical traditions as the dark night of the soul, across shamanic traditions as the dismemberment journey, across alchemical texts as the nigredo, and across psychological texts as ego death. It feels like you're dying because part of you is dying. The ego is dying. The false self is dying. The identity you built to navigate the world is being torn apart. And because you've been identified with that ego, because you've believed that you are your conscious personality, this feels like your death. But it's not. It's the death of a structure, not the death of your essence. It's the death of the container, not the death of the content. It's the death of who you thought you were, so that who you actually are can emerge. Jung wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain." And this is the pain he meant, not the pain of external circumstances, though those may be present too, but the pain of the ego's dissolution, of identity breaking apart, of the death of the self you've known. Let me share testimonials from people describing their breaking point, because hearing that others have survived this exact experience might be the lifeline you need right now. I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, going through the motions of life, but not really there. My husband would talk to me and I could see my mouth moving in response, but I didn't know who was speaking. It was like the person I'd been had evacuated and no one had moved in yet. Diana, 38. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting. I'd try to make simple decisions, what to wear, what to eat, and it was like the part of me that makes decisions had been deleted. I stood in my closet for 45 minutes once, just staring at clothes, unable to choose because I didn't know who I was choosing for. Robert, 45. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the endlessness. I couldn't see any exit. Every day I'd wake up and think, how am I supposed to survive another day like this? And then another day would come, and another, and I started to genuinely believe this was my permanent state, that I'd broken irreparably and would feel this way for the rest of my life. Amanda, 32. I had moments where I didn't recognize my own hands. I'd look at them and think, whose hands are these? Everything felt foreign, like I'd been dropped into someone else's life. Even my memories felt like they belonged to a different person. I couldn't find myself anywhere. Chen, 41. This is the dismemberment stage, and every single person I just quoted made it through to the other side. They survived what felt unsurvivable. They endured what felt unendurable. And they emerged transformed in ways they couldn't have imagined while they were in the middle of the darkness. But here's the crucial part. This stage cannot be bypassed. You cannot think your way out of ego death. You cannot medicate your way past dismemberment. You cannot spiritual bypass the nigredo. This is the descent that must be made. This is the death that must be died. And this is where modern psychiatry often gets it tragically wrong. The medical model sees dismemberment as pathology to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Depression, anxiety, dissociation. These are symptoms to be suppressed with medication so you can return to functioning. And yes, medication has its place, especially when someone is so destabilized they're in danger of suicide or complete psychotic break. But there's a difference between medication that stabilizes you enough to do the psychological work and medication that numbs you so completely that you can avoid the work. There's a difference between support that helps you endure the death process and intervention that aborts the death process prematurely. Jung was adamant about this. The psyche knows what it's doing. The symptoms that bring someone into crisis are not random malfunctions. They are the psyche's intelligent response to an intolerable situation, usually the situation of living a false life, denying essential parts of yourself, or being trapped in patterns that prevent your evolution. The anxiety isn't the problem. It's the signal that something is wrong. The depression isn't the disorder. It's the psyche's way of forcing you to stop, to descend, to encounter what you've been avoiding. The dissociation isn't a malfunction. It's a protective mechanism that allows you to survive overwhelming experience while the deeper work of transformation happens beneath consciousness. This doesn't mean you should suffer needlessly. This doesn't mean you shouldn't seek support, therapy, or medical care. It means understanding that your symptoms might be part of a transformation process, not obstacles to be eliminated, and that premature suppression of the process can abort the very metamorphosis that's trying to happen. Think about the caterpillar in the chrysalis. Inside that cocoon, the caterpillar completely dissolves. Its body liquefies. If you opened the chrysalis during this stage, you wouldn't find a creature transitioning from caterpillar to butterfly. You'd find soup, formless biological material that looks like death and destruction. But it's not, it's metamorphosis. The caterpillar's cells are being broken down so they can be reorganized into a completely different form. The imaginal cells, the cells that carry the template for the butterfly, are activated. The soup is not random chaos. It's precisely orchestrated transformation at the cellular level. This is what's happening to you psychologically during dismemberment. You're not breaking down randomly. You're being broken down so you can be restructured into a new form. And if someone opened your psyche during this stage, all they'd see is soup, formlessness, chaos, dissolution. They wouldn't see the imaginal cells of your true self organizing themselves into new patterns. Jung understood this when he went through his own dismemberment after splitting with Freud. He didn't try to medicate away the visions, suppress the archetypal eruptions, or return to his previous functioning as quickly as possible. He descended into them. He dialogued with them. He recorded them in the Red Book. He allowed himself to be dismembered, trusting that something in him knew what was happening even though his conscious mind was terrified. And what emerged was not a repaired version of his old self. It was a completely new understanding of the psyche, a new approach to psychology, a new relationship to the unconscious. He metamorphosed, but he had to go through the soup stage first. There was no bypass. There was only the descent into darkness, the endurance of dismemberment, and the trust, or sometimes just the absence of any alternative, that something on the other side of death was trying to be born. Time distorts during this stage because the ego, which normally organizes time into past, present, future narrative, is dissolving. Without that organizing structure, you're in what mystics call the eternal now, but what feels when you're suffering like eternal suffering. The present moment stretches to infinity because there's no ego left to create the sense of movement through time. This is why people in deep crisis often say, "I can't imagine tomorrow," or "I can't see any future." They're not being metaphorical. They literally cannot construct a future in imagination because the part of them that projects into future time, the ego, is dying. And paradoxically, this dissolution of timeline is actually bringing you into the present moment, the now, the eternal present where the self, capital S, Jung's term for the divine center, actually lives. The ego lives in time. The self lives in eternity. And to move from ego to self requires the experience of timelessness, even though that timelessness, when you're in pain, feels like endless pain rather than transcendent presence. I need to be very clear about something. If you're in active crisis right now, if you're suicidal, if you're so dissociated you can't function, please seek professional support. Call a crisis line. Get to a therapist or psychiatrist. Let people help you stabilize. What I'm describing is not permission to suffer alone in dangerous ways. But if you're in that gray zone where you're functioning but barely, where you feel like you're dying but you're not in immediate danger, where everything feels meaningless but you're still going through the motions, then understanding that you're in a recognized stage of transformation might be the perspective that helps you endure it. You're not going crazy. You're going through mortificatio. You're not broken permanently. You're in the negredo. You're not dying randomly. You're experiencing ego death, which is the prerequisite for the birth of a new self. And this stage, brutal as it is, has a purpose. It's clearing the ground. It's dissolving the old form. It's destroying the structures that prevent metamorphosis. You cannot become a butterfly by improving yourself as a caterpillar. You can only become a butterfly by completely dissolving as a caterpillar and allowing reformation into something entirely new. Jung wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain." This is the pain, the dismemberment, the death, the dissolution of everything you thought you were. And on the other side, and I promise you, there is another side, is a birth. Not of the improved old you, but of someone you couldn't have become without first dying to who you were. But first, the soup. First, the darkness. First, the dismemberment. There is no way around it. There is only the way through, and you're in it. And it's terrible. And it's also, though you can't see this yet, sacred. You're not falling apart randomly. You're being taken apart carefully by something wiser than your conscious mind, so that you can be put back together as what you were always meant to become. Hold on, endure. Trust that the soup stage is not the end of the story. It's the middle of metamorphosis. And metamorphosis, no matter how it feels while you're in it, is not death. It's transformation. Now we arrive at the metaphysical heart of why breaking is necessary. Not just psychologically helpful, not just therapeutically valuable, but metaphysically required for a specific form of transformation that cannot happen any other way. Jung made a distinction that most people miss, one that's absolutely crucial to understanding your breaking. He distinguished between the ego, the conscious personality, the I that you identify with, and the self with a capital S. The self is not your personal self. It's the totality of your being, the divine center, the God image within you, the part of you that is connected to or identical with the source of all consciousness. The ego is personal. The self is transpersonal. The ego is constructed. The self is essential. The ego is temporal. The self is eternal. And here's the critical point. The ego cannot access the self, not because the self is hidden, but because the ego is too defended, too closed, too identified with its own survival to let the self in. Think of it like this. The ego is a container. It's constructed from your conditioning, your experiences, your adaptations to family and culture, your strategies for survival and belonging. It's necessary. You need it to function in the world. But it's finite, limited, partial. And when that container becomes sealed, when it's defended so completely that nothing new can enter, it becomes a tomb rather than a vessel. The self, that vast, divine, eternal center, is trying to be born through you, trying to manifest through your unique life, trying to individuate, Jung's term for the process of becoming your whole, true self. But it cannot do so while the ego remains in total control, while the container is sealed, while your identity is fixed and rigid and defended against anything that threatens its stability. This is why light cannot enter an unbroken container, not as poetic metaphor, but as spiritual mechanics. An unbroken container is, by definition, closed, and a closed system cannot receive new information, cannot undergo transformation, cannot be penetrated by what's trying to come through. Your breaking is the creation of openings. The cracks are where light gets in. There's a Japanese art form called Kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer. When a ceramic vessel breaks, instead of throwing it away or trying to hide the damage, the Kintsugi master highlights the cracks, filling them with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The repaired vessel is more beautiful, more valuable, more unique than it was before it broke. The breaking becomes part of its beauty. The cracks become veins of gold. But here's what's profound about Kintsugi as metaphor for human transformation. The gold can only be added where the vessel has been broken. The beauty, the value, the uniqueness, all of it comes through the cracks. An unbroken vessel is just ordinary pottery. A broken and repaired vessel is art. Your breaking creates the cracks where the gold can be added. The light, consciousness, divine presence, the self, can only enter where your ego's defenses have been shattered. The wounds become portals. The breaking becomes the beauty. Let me tell you about David because his story perfectly illustrates this principle. David was a neuroscientist, a hardcore materialist, who built his entire identity and career on the belief that consciousness is nothing but brain activity, that there's no soul or spirit or anything beyond the physical, that mysticism is delusion and spirituality is wishful thinking. His atheism wasn't casual, it was militant. He wrote papers debunking near-death experiences as hypoxia-induced hallucinations. He gave lectures ridiculing meditation research as pseudoscience dressed up in academic language. David's container was sealed. His worldview was complete, coherent, defended against anything that didn't fit his materialist paradigm. He was successful, respected, certain. His ego was strong, his defenses impenetrable, his identity as the rational scientist absolute. Then, at 47, he had a massive stroke. His wife found him collapsed in his office, unable to speak or move the right side of his body. In the ambulance, he started seizing. In the ER, he flatlined. They brought him back, but during that time, when his heart had stopped, something happened that David still struggles to articulate. He described it later like this: "I left my body. I know how that sounds. I know what I would have said about anyone claiming this before it happened to me. But I was above the ER, watching them work on my body. I could see the doctors, hear them calling codes, observe the whole scene with perfect clarity. And then I was somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't space, with beings that weren't physical, experiencing something that wasn't time. I was held by a presence of such profound love that every moment of my life suddenly made sense. Every suffering was revealed as necessary. Every joy was magnified into meaning I'd never conceived of. I knew, not believed, but knew with total certainty that consciousness is fundamental, that I am not my body, that death is not ending but transition." David survived. He recovered most of his functioning over months of rehabilitation. But the man who came back was not the man who had the stroke. The neuroscientist who'd spent decades constructing an airtight, materialist worldview found that worldview shattered by an experience he couldn't explain away, couldn't reduce to neurology, couldn't dismiss as hallucination. His container had been broken, and through the cracks, light had entered, numinous experience, direct encounter with what Rudolf Otto called the holy other, what Jung called the self, what mystics across traditions call God or Brahman or the Tao or the ground of being. David's breaking, the stroke, the near death, the dissolution of his defended worldview created the only conditions under which he could have that experience, when his ego was strong and defended, when his rationalist identity was intact, when his container was sealed. The numinous couldn't reach him. Not because it wasn't there, but because he was too closed to receive it. The stroke forced an opening. The near death shattered his defenses. And through that breaking, he experienced what had been trying to reach him his entire life, but couldn't penetrate his fortified rationalism. This is the spiritual physics of transformation. A closed system cannot be transformed by anything outside itself. It can only reconfigure its existing elements. It can self-improve, self-optimize, make itself a more efficient version of what it already is. But it cannot receive genuinely new information, cannot undergo the metamorphosis into something qualitatively different, cannot be penetrated by transcendent reality. Breaking opens the system. It creates the cracks, the gaps, the wounds through which otherness, divine otherness, numinous otherness, the reality of the self can finally enter. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the numinous, experiences of the sacred, the divine, the transpersonal that overwhelm the ego with a sense of something vastly greater than itself. He observed that these experiences almost always occur during or after periods of extreme crisis, suffering, or breaking, not because God punishes people into revelation, but because only crisis creates the conditions, the openness, the vulnerability, the shattering of ego's defenses that allow numinous experience to break through. Think about the great mystics, the spiritual awakeners, the people who've had direct experience of divine reality. Saint Teresa of Avila, who experienced mystical union during severe illness. Ramana Maharshi, who had his awakening during the terror of believing he was dying. Eckhart Tolle, who experienced enlightenment at the bottom of suicidal depression. St. John of the Cross, who wrote about the dark night of the soul as prerequisite for union with God. The pattern is consistent. The dark night precedes illumination. Ego death opens the door to spiritual birth. Breaking creates the cracks where light gets in. And this isn't just mystical testimony. There's emerging research in what's called post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people who've experienced extreme trauma or crisis report not just recovery but transformation into something they perceive as more evolved, more conscious, more connected to meaning than they were before the trauma. People who've survived cancer report a deeper appreciation for life, a clarity about what matters, a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. People who've lost everything, homes to disasters, loved ones to death, identities to catastrophic change, describe emerging with a wisdom and perspective they couldn't have accessed without the loss. This isn't toxic positivity. Everything happens for a reason, platitudes that minimize genuine suffering. This is recognizing a pattern. Profound breaking can create profound opening, not because the suffering itself is good, but because the dissolution of ego's defenses allows access to dimensions of consciousness that aren't available when those defenses are intact. The closed container protects you from pain, yes, but it also protects you from transformation. It keeps you safe but small, defended but disconnected from your depths, intact but isolated from the numinous reality that's trying to break through. David's story continued in a way that illustrates the full arc. After his stroke, he couldn't go back to his old work. Not because he'd lost capacity, he'd regained most of his cognitive function, but because he'd lost belief. He couldn't write papers debunking mysticism anymore because he'd had a mystical experience he couldn't debunk. He couldn't ridicule spirituality because he'd encountered something spiritual that was more real than anything in his previous materialist framework. He went through a period of profound disorientation, identity crisis, career confusion, isolation from colleagues who thought he'd gone crazy or become a New Age convert. His old container was broken and he didn't know how to build a new one. He was in the gap, the space between identities, the void where the old self has died and the new self hasn't fully formed yet. But eventually something began to crystallize. David started working at the intersection of neuroscience and contemplative practice, researching meditation, studying near-death experiences with genuine curiosity rather than dismissive skepticism, exploring consciousness not as epiphenomenon of brain but as fundamental feature of reality. His work became deeper, more interesting, more true than anything he'd done before the stroke. The light that had entered through his breaking, the numinous experience during near-death, reorganized his entire life around a new center, not the ego center of reputation, success, and being right, but the self-center of truth, meaning, and authentic inquiry into the nature of consciousness. His breaking had been precise. It dismantled exactly what needed to be dismantled, his rigid materialism, his defended rationalism, his identity as the one who knew better than the mystics. And through those cracks, light entered that transformed not just his beliefs, but his being. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating ego and self, of allowing the divine center to guide rather than the defended personality to control. And individuation cannot happen, cannot even begin, while the ego's container is sealed. You have to be broken open. There's no gentle way to say it. The light you're seeking, the transformation you're longing for, the connection to meaning and purpose and the sacred, all of it requires that your current form be shattered so that a new form can emerge. Jung wrote, "The gods have become diseases." What he meant is that when we refuse to consciously engage the numinous, when we seal our containers against the divine, when we live entirely in ego's domain and deny the self, the sacred doesn't go away. It erupts through symptoms, through illness, through the catastrophes that break us open by force. Your anxiety might be the sacred trying to get your attention. Your depression might be the self forcing you to descend into depths you've been avoiding. Your crisis might be the gods, or God, or the ground of being, or whatever name you give the numinous, breaking through your defenses because you wouldn't invite them in. And once they break through, once the light enters through the cracks, you cannot go back to the sealed container. You cannot unknow what you've learned. You cannot unsee what you've seen. You cannot reclose the openings that have been created. David couldn't return to his old materialism, not because it wasn't logically coherent, but because he'd experienced something that rendered it incomplete. The light had shown him a dimension of reality that his previous worldview excluded. And once you've seen that dimension, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. This is both the terror and the gift of breaking. The terror is that your old self dies, your old certainties crumble, your old container shatters beyond repair. The gift is that through those cracks, light enters, truth enters, the numinous enters. The self finally has access to consciousness, and transformation becomes possible that wasn't possible before. The Kintsugi metaphor reveals this perfectly. The beauty is in the breaking, not despite the breaking, but because of it. The gold, the light, the consciousness, the divine presence can only be added where there are cracks. An unbroken vessel might be functional, but it's not art. A broken and repaired vessel, with veins of gold running through its cracks, is both functional and sacred. You are being made into art. Your breaking is not destroying you. It's revealing where the gold can be added. Every crack is a potential vein of light. Every wound is a possible portal to the numinous. Every place where you've been shattered is exactly where you can be filled with something more real, more true, more divine than what was there before. But you cannot add gold to unbroken pottery. You cannot let light into a sealed container. You cannot allow the self to emerge while the ego is completely in control. Something must break. Something must shatter. Something must create openings where openings didn't exist before. And what breaks you, the catastrophe, the crisis, the dark night of the soul, is not your enemy. It's the hammer and chisel creating the cracks where light can finally enter. Jung's ultimate insight was this: the self will break through eventually. Either you consciously create space for it through practices like active imagination, dream work, and voluntary confrontation with the unconscious, or it will create its own space by shattering the ego's defenses through crisis, illness, or catastrophic life events. The universe prefers the first path, but if you refuse it, if you remain sealed in your container, defended in your ego, closed to the numinous, then the universe will use the second path. It will break you open, not to harm you, but to liberate you. Not to destroy you, but to allow the light that's been trying to reach you to finally get through. David's stroke was not random. It was the extreme measure necessary to break through defenses so rigid that nothing else could penetrate them. And through that breaking came not just survival, but transformation, not just recovery, but awakening, not just healing, but wholeness. This is why light cannot enter an unbroken container. The container's very intactness, its defended completeness, its sealed perfection, is what prevents the light from getting in. And so the universe, in its fierce compassion, breaks the container, creates the cracks, opens the portals, shatters the defenses, not to destroy you, but to fill you with light, not to end your story, but to begin your true one, not to punish you, but to illuminate you. Your breaking is not the tragedy. Your breaking is the opening, and through that opening, light is entering right now, whether you can see it yet or not. The gold is being added to your cracks, and you are becoming art. Here's where we move from psychological insight into something more controversial, more mystical, and potentially more transformative. The possibility that your breaking is not just meaningful, but precisely designed. That the specific form your catastrophe took, the exact area of your life that collapsed, the particular loss you experienced, all of it is not random, but calibrated. Jung introduced a concept that revolutionized how we think about causality and meaning. He called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that cannot be explained by cause and effect. Events that are connected not by causal chains, but by meaning, by pattern, by what Jung suspected was an underlying intelligence operating in reality that arranges experiences not randomly, but according to a kind of cosmic curriculum. And the most radical application of synchronicity is this. What if your breaking was synchronized with exactly what you needed to learn? What if the universe, or the collective unconscious, or the self, or God, or whatever vast intelligence orchestrates existence, broke you in precisely the area where you most needed to be broken? Let me show you the pattern, because once you see it, you'll recognize it everywhere. The pattern is this. People get broken in the exact dimension they've over-identified with, the thing they've built their entire identity around, the quality they've inflated into their primary self-definition, the area where their ego has become most defended and rigid. That's exactly where the breaking occurs. It's too consistent to be coincidence. The narcissist, someone who's built their entire sense of worth around being beautiful, desirable, admired, gets broken through loss of beauty, aging that they can't prevent, illness that disfigures them, rejection that shatters their belief in their desirability. The very thing they've over-identified with gets stripped away, forcing them to discover identity beyond appearance. The intellectual, someone who's built their ego around being smarter than everyone else, who derives their sense of superiority from cognitive ability, gets broken through the mind, depression that makes thinking impossible, anxiety that scrambles their rationality, or like David in the previous chapter, an experience so numinous that it shatters their rationalist framework entirely. The very faculty they've over-identified with fails them, forcing them to find wisdom beyond intellect. The spiritual bypasser, someone like Sarah who built their identity around being more evolved, more conscious, more transcendent than ordinary humans, gets broken through the body, through desire, through the very earthly hungers they've been trying to transcend. The shadow they've denied erupts precisely in the dimension they've claimed to have mastered, revealing their spirituality as performance rather than integration. The control addict gets broken by chaos they cannot manage. The people-pleaser gets broken when everyone finally leaves anyway. The strong one gets broken by vulnerability they can't muscle through. The independent one gets broken by need they can't self-sufficiently fulfill. The pattern repeats with surgical precision. You get broken exactly where you're most defended. The universe doesn't break you randomly. It breaks you specifically, in the dimension where your ego has become most inflated, most identified, most rigid. Let me give you 5 detailed case studies to make this pattern undeniable. Case 1. The Achiever. Marcus was a surgeon, someone who'd built his entire identity around performance excellence. From childhood, he was the one who succeeded where others failed, who worked harder, achieved more, climbed higher. His self-worth was completely tied to accomplishment. He was valuable because he was successful. He mattered because he achieved. Then, at 52, his hands started trembling. Essential tremor, the diagnosis said. Untreatable, progressive. Within a year, he could no longer operate. The very hands that had defined him, that had performed thousands of surgeries, that had been the instrument of his identity, betrayed him. He lost his career, but more devastatingly, he lost his sense of self. Who was he if he wasn't the brilliant surgeon? What was his worth if he couldn't achieve? The breaking was precise. It dismantled his identity at exactly the point where he'd over-identified with doing rather than being. Case 2. The Caretaker. Linda spent 30 years being the person everyone depended on. She took care of her aging parents, raised 3 kids largely alone, managed her husband's emotional life, counseled her friends through their crises. She was the strong one, the giver, the one who never needed anything from anyone. Her identity was built around being needed. Then, in the same year, her parents died. Her last child left for college, and her husband, finally stable after years of her emotional labor, told her he didn't feel connected to her anymore because she'd never let him see her vulnerability. She'd given everything and everyone left anyway. The breaking was precise. It revealed that her caretaking was actually a defense against her own neediness, and that by never receiving, by never being vulnerable, she'd prevented the very intimacy she thought she was creating. Case 3. The rebel Jake built his identity around being different, countercultural, someone who refused to conform to society's expectations. He dropped out of college, traveled the world, rejected material success, prided himself on living authentically while everyone else lived in the matrix. His ego inflated around being the awakened one among the sleeping masses. Then he got sick. Chronic illness that required exactly the kind of structured medical care, health insurance, and engagement with the system he'd been rejecting. He had to move back in with his parents, the ultimate loss of independence. He had to take government assistance, the ultimate admission of need for the system he'd rejected. The breaking was precise. It forced him to surrender his identity as the independent rebel and confront his judgment of people who need structure, support, and conventional stability. Case 4. The rationalist Elena was a philosophy professor, someone who'd built her entire worldview on logic, reason, and intellectual rigor. She had contempt for people who believed in things that couldn't be proven, who trusted feelings over facts, who claimed spiritual experiences. Her identity was the rational mind surrounded by irrational fools. Then she developed severe OCD, intrusive thoughts that made no logical sense, compulsions she couldn't think her way out of. Her brilliant rational mind turned against her, generating obsessions that her rationality couldn't defeat. She tried cognitive techniques. They failed. She tried logical analysis. It made things worse. The breaking was precise. Her over-identified rational mind became the source of suffering that rationality couldn't solve, forcing her to discover healing through embodied practices, through acceptance, through surrendering the tyranny of the rational mind. Case 5. The Authentic One. Michael, different from Chapter 2's Michael, built his identity around radical honesty. He prided himself on always speaking his truth, never filtering, always being authentic even when it made others uncomfortable. He judged people who were fake or performative. His ego inflated around being more real than everyone else. Then his radical honesty destroyed his marriage. His wife left, saying his truth-telling was actually cruelty disguised as authenticity, that he used honesty as a weapon, that real intimacy requires some filtering and consideration of timing. The breaking was precise. It revealed that his authenticity was actually a defense against emotional attunement, and that sometimes truth without compassion is just aggression with a spiritual rationalization. Do you see the pattern? In every case, the breaking occurred in the exact dimension of over-identification, not randomly, not coincidentally, with what appears to be precise intelligence targeting the area where the ego had become most defended, most inflated, most in need of dissolution. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidence orchestrated by what he termed the collective unconscious, or what we might call the intelligence inherent in reality itself. He suspected that there's a dimension of existence that operates not through mechanical causation, but through meaning, through pattern, through the kind of wisdom that knows exactly what each person needs to learn and creates experiences that teach those exact lessons. This is what I call the cosmic curriculum theory, the idea that there's a transpersonal intelligence authoring your life's experiences according to what your soul needs for its evolution. Not a personal God making arbitrary decisions, but something more like the Tao, the underlying pattern of existence that moves all things toward wholeness, toward balance, toward the realization of their essential nature. And from this perspective, your breaking is not punishment, it's pedagogy. Not random catastrophe, but customized teaching. The universe broke you in exactly the way you needed to be broken to learn what you needed to learn. Here's how to identify your own pattern of precise breaking. Where were you over-identified? What quality, achievement, relationship, or identity had become your primary self-definition? What would someone list first if describing you? That's usually the area of over-identification. What broke first or most completely? In any breaking, there's usually one area that collapses most dramatically. That's not random. That's where the teaching is focused. What quality did you judge most harshly in others? Remember shadow work? What you condemn most vehemently often reveals what you're most defended against in yourself. And your breaking often forces you to embody exactly what you've been judging. What belief system or worldview collapsed? The ideas you were most certain about, most defended of, most identified with, those are the beliefs the breaking tends to shatter. What did you think made you valuable? Your worth story, the narrative about why you matter, why you deserve love, what makes you acceptable. That's what breaking often reveals as false or conditional. Now, I know this raises an uncomfortable question. If your breaking is precisely designed, does that mean there's a designer? Does this require belief in God or some cosmic intelligence? Not necessarily. Jung avoided dogmatic claims about whether synchronicity implied a personal God. He simply observed that reality seems to organize itself according to patterns of meaning that cannot be explained by materialist cause and effect. Whether you call that organizing principle God, the Tao, the collective unconscious, the self, or simply the intelligence inherent in complex systems, the pattern remains. You don't have to believe in a cosmic designer to recognize that your breaking seems meaningfully related to what you most needed to learn. But here's where I'll go further than Jung publicly did. I believe there is intelligence in your destruction. I believe your breaking is not random chaos, but intelligent intervention. I believe something in reality, whether transcendent or immanent, personal or impersonal, loves you too much to let you remain in false identity, defensive rigidity, or over-identification with partial self. And I believe this intelligence breaks you with precision, targeting exactly the dimension where your ego has become most calcified, most defended, most in need of surrender. If you've been broken and you're reading this, I want you to do something right now. Pause and ask yourself, where was I over-identified? What did your ego build itself around? What quality or identity or achievement did you believe made you valuable, special, safe, or superior? And then look at where you broke. Look at what collapsed. Look at what was stripped away. I'd bet anything they're the same dimension. Your breaking and your over-identification are synchronized. There's even a correlation with astrology that's too consistent to ignore, even for those skeptical of astrological frameworks. Jung himself studied astrology and saw it as a symbolic system for understanding synchronistic patterns. And in astrological terms, your breaking often correlates with what are called outer planet transits, particularly Saturn returns or Pluto transits. Saturn returns happen approximately every 29 years and force maturation, responsibility, confrontation with reality. Pluto transits force death and rebirth in whatever area of life they're touching, and people consistently report that their most profound breakings occurred during these transit periods, times when, astrologically speaking, cosmic forces are compelling transformation in specific areas of life. You don't have to believe in astrology's mechanism to recognize the pattern. There seem to be cycles and timing to breaking that align with larger rhythms beyond individual psychology. But whether you frame this as astrology, synchronicity, divine intervention, or the intelligence of complex systems, the point remains. Your breaking is not random, it's purposeful. It's teaching you something you needed to learn, and it's breaking you exactly where you needed to be broken. Jung wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." And once you see the pattern of precise breaking, once you recognize that your catastrophe is synchronized with your curriculum, everything changes. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What am I meant to learn from this?" You stop experiencing your breaking as random victimization and start recognizing it as precise intervention. You stop resisting the destruction and start interrogating it for its teaching. Your breaking is not proof that the universe is random or cruel. It's evidence that the universe is intelligent and fiercely committed to your evolution. It broke you exactly where you needed to be broken, at exactly the time you needed to be broken, in exactly the way that would teach you what you most needed to learn. This is the cosmic curriculum, and you're not a victim of it, you're a student in it. And the lesson being taught through your breaking is the one your soul enrolled for before you were conscious enough to recognize it. The universe doesn't break you carelessly. It breaks you surgically, targeting the tumor of false identity with precision, removing the cancer of over-identification with mercy disguised as catastrophe. And once you see that your breaking and your lesson are synchronized, once you recognize the intelligence in your destruction, you can finally stop fighting it and start learning from it. Because the curriculum isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to educate you, and the lesson is always the same. You are not who you thought you were. You are vastly more than the identity you over-identified with. And now that false identity has been broken, your true nature can finally emerge. There's a moment in every hero's journey, every initiation rite, every transformative ordeal, when the seeker comes face to face with what mythologists call the threshold guardian. It's the final test, the ultimate obstacle, the last and most terrifying challenge before breakthrough occurs. And it appears at the exact moment when you're most exhausted, most hopeless, most convinced that you cannot endure another day. This is not coincidence, this is pattern. And if you're in this stage right now, if your symptoms are intensifying just when you thought they should be improving, if the darkness is deepening when you expected dawn, you need to understand what's actually happening, because what feels like regression is often the final stage before transformation. What looks like you're getting worse might actually mean You're about to break through. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. Patients would often experience their most severe symptoms, their most intense crisis, their most profound despair right before a major breakthrough, not occasionally, consistently, so consistently that he came to see it not as unfortunate complication, but as reliable indicator that deep transformation was imminent. But here's the tragedy. Most people quit right before the dawn. They abandon the process 3 feet from gold. They give up at the exact moment when breakthrough was finally approaching, because they interpret the intensification as evidence of failure rather than recognizing it as the threshold guardian, the final test before crossing into new territory. In behavioral psychology, there's a concept called extinction burst. When you're trying to eliminate a habitual behavior, the behavior doesn't gradually fade. Right before it dies, it surges. It intensifies dramatically in one final attempt to maintain itself. If you're trying to quit smoking, there will be a moment when your cravings become more intense than they've been in weeks. If you're breaking a relationship pattern, there will be a moment when the urge to return to that pattern becomes overwhelming. This isn't relapse. This is extinction burst, the old pattern's last desperate attempt to survive. And if you can endure it, if you can recognize it for what it is and not give in, the pattern dies, the craving ends, the compulsion releases, but you have to survive the burst. The same mechanism operates at the level of identity transformation. Your ego, your old self, your defended personality, your false identity doesn't die quietly. Right before it finally surrenders, it fights back with everything it has. It generates the worst symptoms, the deepest despair, the most convincing arguments for why transformation is impossible, and you should just give up and go back to who you were. This is the threshold guardian at the psychological level. It's your ego's extinction burst, and it's precisely calibrated to occur when you're most vulnerable, most exhausted, most likely to believe its lies. Let me tell you about Rachel because her story captures this stage perfectly. Rachel had been in therapy for 2 years, working through severe panic disorder that had developed after a sexual assault. She'd done everything right: trauma therapy, EMDR, somatic work, medication when needed, and for months she'd been improving. The panic attacks became less frequent, less intense. She was starting to rebuild her life, reconnect with friends, even date again. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, everything collapsed. Her panic attacks returned with an intensity that surpassed even her original crisis. She couldn't leave her house. She couldn't sleep. She was having multiple attacks per day, each one convincing her she was dying. Every technique that had been working suddenly stopped working. Every tool she'd developed seemed useless. Rachel was convinced she was regressing, that all her progress had been illusion, that she was actually getting worse rather than better. She told her therapist, "I can't do this anymore. I thought I was healing, but I'm right back where I started. Maybe even worse. I think I need to accept that this is just who I am now. Someone who's permanently broken." Her therapist, someone trained in Jungian approaches, recognized what was actually happening. She told Rachel, "You're not regressing, you're at the threshold. This intensification is your psyche's final test before the pattern actually releases. Your ego is fighting for its life because it knows it's about to lose control. This is the extinction burst, and if you can endure it for just a little longer, the panic will actually die rather than just go dormant." Rachel didn't believe her. How could the worst symptoms she'd ever experienced be a sign of impending breakthrough? It made no sense, but she was too exhausted to quit. So she kept going, not out of hope, but out of absence of alternatives. And then, after 2 weeks of this intensified hell, something shifted. She woke up one morning and the panic was gone. not reduced, not managed. Gone. She could feel in her body that something fundamental had changed. The pattern that had been holding her hostage had finally released. The threshold guardian had been passed. Rachel described it later. It was like my nervous system was making one final argument for why I needed to stay hypervigilant, why I needed the panic to protect me. And when I survived that argument, when I endured the worst it could throw at me and didn't die, didn't go insane, didn't collapse, something in me finally believed I was actually safe. The panic lost its power because I'd proven I could survive even its most intense version. This is the mechanism of the threshold guardian. It's not just random symptom flare-up. It's the old pattern's final test of your commitment to transformation. It's asking, do you really want to change? Because I'm going to make this as hard as possible. I'm going to convince you that transformation is impossible. I'm going to tempt you back to familiar suffering. And only if you can endure this final ordeal will I release my hold. In mythology, the threshold guardian takes many forms. In the Odyssey, it's Scylla and Charybdis, the impossible choice between two devastating options that must be navigated at the story's climax. In Star Wars, it's the Death Star trench run, the moment of maximum danger right before the breakthrough that destroys the Empire's weapon. In fairy tales, it's the final impossible task the hero must complete before winning the prize. The pattern is universal. Right before breakthrough, there's a moment of supreme crisis, a final test, a threshold that must be crossed. And the crossing is always terrifying because it requires moving forward into complete uncertainty, while your entire being is screaming to retreat to familiar territory. Jung himself experienced this during his confrontation with the unconscious. There was a period, about 3 years into his breakdown, when his symptoms intensified dramatically. The visions became more overwhelming, the sense of fragmentation more severe. He wrote in his journals that he feared he was approaching complete psychosis, that he'd gone too far into the darkness and would never find his way back. This was his threshold guardian moment, and if he'd quit then, if he'd medicalized his experience, suppressed the visions, returned to conventional functioning, he would never have completed the journey that led to his revolutionary understanding of the psyche. But he endured. He kept engaging with the archetypal material, even when it felt like it was destroying him. And on the other side of that intensification was clarity, integration, and the birth of analytical psychology. Here's why the threshold guardian exists. Genuine transformation requires that you prove your commitment. The psyche will not allow you to access new territory until you've demonstrated that you're truly willing to leave the old territory behind. The old patterns, the old identity, the old defenses, they will not release you until they're absolutely certain you're not coming back. So they test you. They create conditions that make returning to the old self seem like the only rational choice. They generate symptoms so intense that giving up on transformation and settling for management seems like wisdom rather than surrender. They orchestrate a crisis that asks, are you really ready to be someone new? Because I'm going to make you prove it. And most people fail this test, not because they're weak, but because they don't recognize it as a test. They interpret the intensification as evidence that transformation isn't working, that healing isn't real, that they should abandon the journey and return to the familiar prison of who they were. This is the 3 feet from gold phenomenon. The metaphor comes from a story about a man during the gold rush who spent months digging a mine, hit a vein of ore, then gave up when the vein seemed to disappear. He sold his equipment and his claim. The man who bought the claim hired an engineer who calculated that the vein hadn't disappeared, it had just taken a turn. The new owner resumed digging 3 feet from where the previous owner had quit, and hit one of the largest gold deposits in California history, 3 feet from gold. That's where most people quit. Right before breakthrough, right when the threshold guardian is doing its job of testing commitment, right when endurance is most required and hope is most absent. So how do you know if you're at the threshold rather than actually regressing? How do you distinguish genuine deterioration from the extinction burst? Here are 5 markers that you're at the threshold, not falling backward. Marker 1. The intensification feels different from your original crisis. When you're truly regressing, it feels familiar. You're returning to old patterns in old ways. When you're at the threshold, the intensity might be greater, but there's a quality of unfamiliarity to it. It feels like something trying to break through rather than just returning. Marker 2. You have fleeting moments of unprecedented clarity or peace. At the threshold, you'll often experience brief moments, sometimes just seconds, of a completely different state, a sudden peace that has no cause, a moment of clarity about your purpose, a flash of connection to something larger. These glimpses are preview of what's trying to emerge, even as the threshold guardian tries to prevent emergence. Marker 3. Your dreams become more intense, more vivid, more archetypal. The unconscious becomes more active at the threshold. Your dreams might become unusually vivid, filled with powerful symbols, or feature figures that seem to carry meaning beyond personal content. This is the self trying to communicate guidance, even as the ego is in crisis. Marker 4. You feel like you're being forced to choose between 2 identities. The threshold is the place between worlds. You're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. This in-between state creates intense pressure to commit to one side or the other. The threshold guardian is asking, are you going back to the old self or forward to the new one? Marker 5. The suffering has a quality of something trying to be born rather than something dying. This is subtle, but people at the threshold often describe their pain as having a forward-moving quality. Like labor pains, it's not the pain of something ending, but the pain of something trying to come through. There's an urgency to it, a sense that something is trying to happen if you can just endure a little longer. Rachel experienced all 5 markers. Her panic attacks felt different, more intense, but also more impersonal, like they were happening to her rather than being generated by her. She had brief moments of profound peace that made no sense given her circumstances. Her dreams became filled with images of birth, of doorways, of crossing thresholds. She felt caught between 2 versions of herself, the traumatized one and the liberated one, and knew she had to choose. And the panic itself had a quality of something trying to break through her nervous system, rather than just recurring pathology. These markers told her therapist that Rachel was at the threshold, not regressing. And that information, that reframe, gave Rachel just enough perspective to endure the final test without quitting. But here's what makes this stage so difficult. It requires faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but faith that the process you're in has intelligence, that the intensification means something, that endurance will be rewarded even though you have no evidence yet. This is why so many people fail at the threshold. We've been trained by modern culture to trust only what we can see, measure, and predict. We've been taught that worsening symptoms mean worsening condition. We've been conditioned to medicate discomfort immediately, rather than interrogating it for meaning. So when the threshold guardian appears, when symptoms intensify right before breakthrough, our cultural conditioning tells us to retreat, to medicate, to give up and settle for management rather than transformation. We're not taught to recognize this stage as the final test, the extinction burst, the threshold crossing that must be endured. Jung understood this, which is why he was controversial among his psychiatric colleagues. He didn't always rush to suppress symptoms. He didn't always medicate away the crisis. He sometimes encouraged patients to stay in the fire a little longer, to endure the threshold, to trust that the intensification might be meaningful rather than just pathological. This doesn't mean suffering should never be alleviated. This doesn't mean all symptoms should be endured without support. But it means understanding that sometimes, the darkest moment is actually the moment right before dawn, and that premature rescue can abort the very transformation that the suffering was preparing. There's a reason the ancients understood initiation as requiring ordeal. Vision quests put initiates alone in the wilderness until they had their vision, however long that took, however much suffering was involved. Rites of passage involved pain, isolation, confrontation with death. These weren't sadistic traditions. They were technologies for ensuring that transformation was complete, that the threshold was fully crossed, that the initiate didn't return to the tribe still halfway between identities. Modern culture has lost these rites. We have no elders to tell us, this is the threshold, this is supposed to be hard, this is the final test. Endure just a little longer and you'll emerge transformed. Instead, we have a medical model that sees all intensification as pathology and all suffering as something to eliminate as quickly as possible. But the psyche knows better. Your soul knows better. And when you're at the threshold, when the threshold guardian is testing your commitment, something in you deeper than your conscious mind knows that this is the final stage, not a return to the beginning. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." And the threshold guardian is the mechanism of outgrowing. It forces you to prove that you've genuinely outgrown the old patterns by subjecting you to their most intense version one final time. If you survive this without reverting, if you endure the panic without returning to the protective patterns that created it, if you sit with the depression without numbing or distracting, if you face the threshold guardian without fleeing, then the old pattern loses its power, not because you've defeated it, but because you've proven you no longer need it. Rachel's panic attacks stopped not because she learned to manage them better, but because she survived their worst version without the attacks serving their purpose. The attacks were trying to convince her she wasn't safe, that she needed hypervigilance to survive, and when she endured maximum panic without catastrophe occurring, her nervous system finally believed it could release the defense. This is why it gets darkest before dawn, not as cruel cosmic joke, but as final examination. The threshold guardian asks, "Are you truly committed to becoming someone new? Because I'm going to make you prove it. I'm going to give you every reason to quit, every excuse to return, every justification for staying who you were. And only if you keep moving forward anyway, without evidence, without guarantee, without hope even, only then will I step aside and let you pass." If you're in this stage right now, if you're experiencing the intensification, if you're convinced you're failing when you might actually be on the verge of breakthrough, I need you to consider the possibility that you're not 3 feet from disaster, you're 3 feet from gold. The darkness getting darker might mean dawn is approaching. The symptoms getting worse might mean the old pattern is dying. The suffering intensifying might mean transformation is imminent. You're at the threshold, and the guardian is doing its job, and your job is simply to endure, not to hope, not to believe, not to understand, just to endure, just to keep breathing, just to not quit. Because on the other side of this guardian is the new territory you've been dying to reach, the freedom you've been working toward, the self you've been trying to become. But you have to pass the test first. You have to face the threshold guardian. You have to endure the extinction burst. You have to survive the darkness getting darker. And if you do, if you stay in the fire just a little longer, if you refuse to quit 3 feet from gold, if you recognize this intensification as the final stage rather than evidence of failure, then the dawn comes. Not gradually, not ambiguously, but definitively. The old pattern dies, the guardian steps aside, and you cross the threshold into transformation that was impossible to achieve any other way. Hold on. The darkness deepening means the dawn is approaching. You're closer than you think. You're at the threshold, not the beginning. And breakthrough is coming. We've talked about understanding your breaking, about recognizing its patterns and intelligence, about enduring the threshold. Now I want to give you something practical, something you can actually do during the darkness, a method for directly engaging with the force that broke you. This is Jung's technique of active imagination, specifically adapted for the breakdown phase. It's one of the most powerful practices Jung developed, and it's also one of the most misunderstood. This is not meditation. This is not visualization. This is not positive affirmation or manifestation work. This is something far more confrontational, more dangerous, and more transformative. It's direct dialogue with the unconscious. Active imagination is the practice of personifying the forces within your psyche. Shadow figures, archetypal energies, autonomous complexes, and consciously engaging them in conversation. Not passive reception of images, but active confrontation. You're not just observing the unconscious, you're negotiating with it. And during breaking, what you're negotiating with is the force that destroyed you. Whether you conceive of it as God, universe, self, unconscious, or simply the intelligence operating in your catastrophe, active imagination allows you to directly address it, question it, rage at it, and ultimately receive its guidance. Jung developed this technique during his own confrontation with the unconscious. After splitting with Freud, when archetypal forces began erupting from his psyche, Jung didn't just observe them passively, he engaged them, he argued with them, he demanded answers from them, and he recorded these dialogues in what became the Red Book, one of the most extraordinary documents of a mind in crisis, directly engaging with its own depths. In one famous encounter, Jung met a figure he called Philemon, an old man with wings of a kingfisher who became Jung's inner teacher. Jung didn't just visualize Philemon, he walked with him in his garden, had actual conversations with him, argued with him about the nature of reality, and Philemon taught Jung things that Jung's conscious mind didn't know, revealed perspectives Jung hadn't considered, offered wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond Jung's personal psychology. This is the power and the strangeness of active imagination. When done properly, the figures you encounter seem to have autonomy. They say things you didn't consciously intend. They offer perspectives you didn't expect. They teach you things you didn't know you knew. Jung wrote, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." Active imagination is the practice of looking inside so intensely that you awaken to the autonomous forces operating within your psyche. Now, I need to be very clear about what active imagination is not, because there are dangers here. It is not dissociation. You're not trying to escape your conscious awareness or lose touch with reality. You maintain ego consciousness throughout the practice. You're always aware that you're engaging with internal forces, not external spirits or entities. It is not psychosis. You're deliberately choosing to engage with unconscious content in a controlled way, not being overwhelmed by it involuntarily. There's a crucial difference between choosing to dialogue with inner figures and being overtaken by voices you can't control. It is not fantasy or daydreaming. You're not making up a story or entertaining yourself with pleasant images. You're confronting real autonomous complexes within your psyche, and the encounter often involves conflict, challenge, and discomfort. Because of these distinctions, active imagination has contraindications. If you're actively psychotic, If you have severe dissociative disorders, if you're in acute crisis where you cannot maintain ego stability, this is not the practice for you right now. You need stabilization first, preferably with professional support. But if you're in that space where you're broken but functional, shattered but still conscious, dealing with catastrophe but not actively in danger, then active imagination can be the bridge between you and the wisdom hidden in your destruction. Here's the step-by-step protocol for active imagination, specifically for dialoguing with the force that broke you. Step 1. Create sacred space and set intention. This practice requires privacy, uninterrupted time, at least 30-45 minutes, and a way to record what emerges. You can write, speak into a recorder, or draw. Jung emphasized the importance of giving the dialogue concrete form, not keeping it purely mental. Sit comfortably, close your eyes if that helps you turn inward. Take several deep breaths to center yourself. Then set a clear intention. I want to engage with the force that broke me. I want to understand why this happened. I'm ready to listen. Step 2. Personify the force. Here's where it gets strange, but necessary. You're going to give the force that destroyed you a form, not because you believe it literally has that form, but because the psyche thinks in images and personification allows dialogue. Ask yourself, if the force that broke me had a form, what would it be? Some people see a figure, wise elder, dark goddess, shadow creature, divine being. Some see a force of nature, storm, fire, ocean. Some see abstract forms, spirals of energy, geometric patterns, light and dark. Don't force it. Let an image arise naturally. And when something appears, address it directly. I see you. I know you're the force that destroyed my life. I want to understand why. Step 3. Ask the confrontational questions. This is not passive reception. This is active engagement. You're going to ask the questions you've been carrying, and you're going to demand answers. Some examples. Why did you break me? What did you want from me? What was wrong with who I was? What are you trying to teach me? What do I need to do now? How long will this last? Ask the questions that matter to you. Don't be polite. Don't be spiritual. Be honest. If you're angry at the force that broke you, express that anger. If you're terrified, express that terror. Authentic confrontation is more productive than performed reverence. Step 4. Listen for the response. This is the crucial and strange part. After you ask a question, wait. Don't answer it yourself. Don't create a response you think you should hear. Wait in the silence until something arises that surprises you. The response might come as words, as images, as feelings, as sudden knowing. It might be what you expected, or it might completely contradict your assumptions. The key marker of genuine active imagination is that the response feels autonomous, like it's coming from somewhere other than your conscious intention. Jung emphasized this. The figures you meet in active imagination must be allowed their autonomy. You're not controlling them, you're encountering them. Step 5. Engage in actual dialogue. Don't just ask one question and receive one answer. Engage. Argue back if the response doesn't satisfy you. Ask follow-up questions. Challenge what you're told. The dialogue should feel like a real conversation, with both parties having agency. Jung's dialogues with Philemon lasted hours sometimes, with Jung arguing against Philemon's teachings, Philemon responding to Jung's objections, back and forth like teacher and student wrestling with difficult truth. Your dialogue with your destroyer might be similar. It might tell you things you don't want to hear. You might resist. It might challenge you back. This confrontation is the point. You're not seeking comfortable answers, but authentic engagement with the force that knows why you needed to be broken. Step 6. Record everything immediately. As soon as the dialogue feels complete, and you'll feel when it's finished, there's a natural ending point, write down or draw or record everything that happened. Not later, immediately. The unconscious material fades quickly if not captured. Jung insisted on this. The Red Book wasn't created from memory. It was recorded during and immediately after his active imagination sessions. The act of recording is part of the practice because it brings unconscious content into conscious form. Step 7. Reflect and integrate. Later, when you're out of the active imagination state, read or review what emerged. Look for insights you missed during the dialogue. Consider what the destroyer told you. Don't dismiss uncomfortable messages, but don't accept everything uncritically either. The unconscious can be wise, but it can also be wrong. Your job is to integrate what serves your wholeness and challenge what doesn't. Let me give you examples from Jung's Red Book to show what this actually looks like. In one encounter, Jung meets a figure called Salome, accompanied by the blind prophet Elijah. He's terrified of Salome because she represents the dangerous, destructive feminine energy he's been trying to control. He asks her why she's terrifying him. She responds, "You fear me because you fear your own desire, your own life force, your own wildness. But I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to liberate you from the prison of your rational mind." Jung argues with her, "But if I surrender to you, I'll lose my sanity, my work, everything I've built." Salome responds, "You've already lost it. Your breakdown has already destroyed the rational structure. I'm offering you something else. Direct experience of the divine, unmediated by thought. But you have to dance with me. You have to let yourself be moved by forces you cannot control." The dialogue continues, with Jung terrified, but gradually opening to what Salome represents. He doesn't just receive her wisdom passively. He fights it, questions it, slowly allows it to transform him. This is active imagination at its most intense. Confrontation with the autonomous forces of the psyche that have been breaking you open. Now let me share script templates to help you begin if you're not sure how to start. Template 1. Direct address to the universe. Universe, I know you've been breaking me. I know this isn't random. I'm ready to hear why. Show me what I need to understand. Then wait. See what image or figure or force appears in response. You have built yourself so carefully. Brick by brick, year by year, you have constructed a fortress around the tender, trembling truth of who you are. You have learned which masks earn approval, which performances guarantee safety, which versions of yourself are permitted to exist in the world. And you have become so skilled at this architecture of the false self that you have forgotten it is architecture at all. You mistake the walls for your skin. You confuse the fortress for your soul. The ego is a master builder. It takes the raw, chaotic material of your authentic being and shapes it into something manageable, something that can navigate the social world without too much friction, something that can survive. In childhood, this is necessary. You learn to hide your rage so you are not punished. You learn to suppress your needs so you are not abandoned. You learn to perform competence so you are not shamed. These adaptations are not weakness. They are survival. The ego does what it must to protect the vulnerable core of your being from a world that is not always safe enough to receive it. But survival strategies, when extended beyond their usefulness, become prisons. The masks you wore to protect yourself become the walls that suffocate you. The persona, that carefully curated presentation of self that you show to the world, stops being a tool and becomes a tyrant. You begin to believe that you are the role you play, the competent one, the strong one, the one who has it all figured out, the one who needs nothing, the one who can hold it all together. And so you hold. You hold together contradictions that were never meant to coexist. You hold together the pretense of wholeness while fragmenting internally. You hold together a story about yourself that grows more distant from your lived experience with each passing year. You become an expert in repair, in patching over the cracks, in maintaining the structure even as the foundation crumbles beneath your feet. The exhaustion of this maintenance is extraordinary. Most of your psychic energy is devoted not to living but to performing life, not to feeling but to managing the appearance of appropriate feeling, not to connecting but to controlling how you are perceived in connection. You are so busy holding the fortress together that you have no energy left for the genuine encounter with existence. You have built a monument to a false self and appointed yourself its eternal caretaker. And the terrible truth is this: you cannot see what you refuse to see. The eyes you have turned away from your own shadow, from your own depth, from your own authentic longing. These eyes cannot suddenly perceive light. You have spent years, perhaps decades, training yourself in a particular kind of blindness. You have organized your entire identity around not looking at certain truths about yourself. Your relationships are built on these mutual agreements of unseeing. Your success is constructed on the foundation of what you have refused to acknowledge. The shadow grows in the darkness you create. Everything you have rejected about yourself, your rage, your need, your desire, your grief, your shame, your wild longing, accumulates in the unconscious, pressing against the walls of your carefully constructed identity. Jung understood what we spend our lives trying to forget. That which we do not bring to consciousness emerges as fate. The shadow does not disappear because you refuse to look at it. It grows stronger. It waits. It finds ways to leak through the cracks in your defenses, sabotaging your carefully laid plans, erupting in moments when your control slips. But the ego, magnificent and desperate, tightens its grip. When the shadow presses, you build thicker walls. When the authentic self whispers its discontent, you perform harder, achieve more, prove to yourself and the world that you are who you say you are. You mistake exhaustion for discipline. You mistake numbness for peace. You mistake the absence of visible breakdown for the presence of genuine health. The universe watches this with the patience of geology. It does not intervene according to your timeline. It does not negotiate with your defenses. It does not ask permission to teach you what you need to learn. Instead, it waits, precise and implacable, until the structure you have built becomes so rigid, so divorced from the truth of your being, so fundamentally unsustainable that only complete collapse can liberate what lies beneath. This is not cruelty. This is love wearing the mask of devastation. The universe values your authentic becoming more than your comfortable performance. It refuses to let you waste your one irreplaceable existence, maintaining a monument to who you were taught to be, instead of discovering who you actually are. And so it creates the conditions for breaking, not randomly, not arbitrarily. With terrible precision, it applies pressure to exactly the places where your fortress is most rigid, most defended, most desperately maintained. The relationship you built your identity around begins to crumble. The career that defined your worth collapses. The body you took for granted betrays you. The role you performed so perfectly becomes impossible to sustain. The mask you wore so long begins to suffocate you. At first, you respond the way you always have, with more effort, more control, more desperate maintenance. You work harder to hold it together. You perform more convincingly. You build new defenses on top of failing defenses. You tell yourself stories about resilience, about pushing through, about not giving up. And these stories work for a time. The fortress holds, even as the foundation crumbles. But there comes a moment, and Jung called this enantiodromia, the turning point where everything becomes its opposite, when the very mechanisms you built to survive become the instruments of your destruction. Your strength, maintained too rigidly, becomes brittleness. Your independence, defended too absolutely, becomes isolation. Your competence, performed too perfectly, becomes a prison of impossible standards. Your control, exercised too completely, becomes the chaos you were trying to prevent. The fortress does not crumble slowly, it shatters, and the shattering is not gentle. Identity collapse arrives not as gradual erosion, but as catastrophic failure. Everything you thought defined you reveals itself as conditional. The relationships built on your false presentation cannot survive your authentic need. The success constructed on your performance crumbles when you can no longer perform. The certainties you organized your life around dissolve like morning fog in harsh sunlight. You discover that you do not know who you are without your defenses. You have forgotten or never knew how to exist without the fortress. The persona you wore has adhered so completely to your sense of self that its removal feels like the removal of skin. You are raw, you are exposed, you are unrecognizable to yourself. This is the alchemical nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the complete dissolution that medieval alchemists understood as the necessary first stage of any genuine transformation. You cannot transmute lead into gold without first dissolving the lead entirely. You cannot become who you are meant to be without first allowing who you think you are to die completely. And death is what this feels like, not metaphorical death, not poetic death, the actual psychological experience of dying. Your defenses, built so carefully over decades, cease to function. The shadow material you spent your life suppressing floods into consciousness. The authentic needs you denied demand acknowledgement. The grief you postponed arrives in full force. The rage you suppressed ignites. The vulnerability you armored against overwhelms your capacity to manage it. You descend, like Inanna stripped naked and hung on a hook in the underworld, like Orpheus torn apart by Maenads for the crime of looking back, like Osiris dismembered and scattered. The myths remember what modern psychology often forgets. Genuine transformation requires genuine death. The old self must be completely destroyed before the new self can be born. And this is unbearable. You would do anything to make it stop. You would give anything to rebuild the fortress, to return to the familiar prison of the false self, to go back to the exhausting but manageable performance of who you were. But the fortress cannot be rebuilt. The persona once shattered cannot be reassembled. The defenses once collapsed cannot be restored. You have crossed a threshold and there is no return. The terror of this moment is that you do not know what lies beyond the breaking. The fortress, for all its suffocation, was known. The false self, for all its exhaustion, was familiar. You knew how to be that person. You knew how to navigate the world from within those walls. But this raw, exposed, undefended existence, this you do not know how to do. And yet, in the ruins of your false identity, in the wreckage of your carefully constructed life, something begins to happen that you could never have anticipated from within the fortress. The walls that kept you safe also kept out the light. The defenses that protected you also imprisoned you. And now that they have fallen, now that you are broken open completely, light begins to pour in. Not gently, not gradually. It floods in with an intensity that those who have lived in self-imposed darkness can barely comprehend. It illuminates everything, the shadow you hid, the needs you denied, the truth you avoided, the authentic self you buried beneath layers of adaptation and performance. And this illumination is not comfortable. It is not reassuring. It is devastating in its clarity, but it is real. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, perhaps your entire life, you are encountering reality without the mediating filter of your defenses. You are meeting yourself, not the constructed self, not the performed self, but the actual self that has been waiting beneath the fortress all along. And this self is not what you expected. It is more complex, more contradictory, more wounded, more powerful, more needing, more capable. than the simplified version you presented to the world. The breaking has not destroyed you. It has revealed you. The shattering has not ended you. It has opened you. And the light that floods through the cracks is not external salvation arriving to rescue you. It is the self, the deep organizing center of your being, the transpersonal core from which authentic consciousness emerges, finally visible because the walls you built to obscure it have fallen. This is what the universe was waiting for. Not your comfort, not your convenience, not your readiness, but this moment when the false could no longer be sustained, when the defenses could no longer function, when the fortress became so unbearable that even complete collapse was preferable to one more day of maintaining the lie. The universe breaks you because you matter, because your authentic becoming is valued more than your comfortable stagnation, because the light that you are, the genuine consciousness, the real self, the true being beneath all the adaptive layers, is too precious to remain forever hidden behind walls of your own construction. And so you lie in the ruins, shattered and raw, exposed and undefended, encountering the terrible grace of complete dissolution. The old self is dead. The fortress has fallen. The persona has been stripped away. And you do not yet know what will emerge from this wreckage. You know only that you cannot go back, that the breaking was necessary, that the light pouring through the cracks is both unbearable and undeniable. You have been broken open, and the breaking, you begin to dimly understand, was not the end. It was the only possible beginning. In the immediate aftermath of shattering, there is only disorientation. You lie in the ruins of who you were, surrounded by fragments of the identity you spent your life constructing, and you cannot yet see what this devastation has made possible. The fortress has fallen, yes, but you are still thinking like someone who needs a fortress. You are still searching for walls to rebuild, still reaching for the familiar architecture of defense, still trying to reassemble the persona that protected you, even as it suffocated you. But something has fundamentally shifted. The defenses, once collapsed, cannot be restored in their original form. You try to put the mask back on, and it no longer fits. You try to perform the old role, and the performance feels hollow, transparent, impossible to sustain. You try to retreat into the familiar patterns of control, and you discover that control itself has become uncontrollable. The breaking has done its work too thoroughly. There is no return to the person you were before. This is the most disorienting phase of transformation, when the old self is dead but the new self has not yet emerged. You are between identities, between worlds, suspended in a psychological space that has no clear coordinates. Jung called this the temenos, the sacred precinct where transformation occurs, but from inside it feels less like sacred space and more like terrifying emptiness. You do not know who you are without your defenses. You do not know how to exist without the stories you told yourself about yourself. And yet, if you can bear to remain in this emptiness, rather than immediately rushing to fill it with new defenses, something extraordinary begins to happen. The light that flooded in during the breaking does not recede. It remains steady and clarifying, illuminating landscapes of your inner world that you have never seen before. And gradually, you begin to realize something that transforms everything. This light is not coming from outside. It was always here. The breaking did not bring the light. It simply removed the obstacles that prevented you from perceiving it. The self, that deep organizing center of your being that Jung distinguished from the ego, has always been present. It has been there beneath the fortress, beneath the persona, beneath the adaptive layers you constructed for survival. But the ego, in its inflation and its desperate maintenance of control, obscured it completely. You could not perceive the self because you were too busy defending the ego's illusion of autonomy, too committed to the false story of who you thought you should be. Now, in brokenness, The ego has been humbled, not destroyed. That is crucial to understand. The ego is necessary. You need it to navigate the world, to make decisions, to maintain boundaries, to function in relationship and society. But the ego was never meant to be the center of your being. It was meant to serve the self, to be the instrument through which deeper consciousness could engage with the world. The breaking has returned the ego to its proper place, no longer master but servant, no longer tyrant but tool. And from this new arrangement, something begins to emerge that could never have emerged from within the defended fortress. The shadow material that you spent your life suppressing can finally be acknowledged. The rage that you buried because it was unacceptable can be felt. The grief that you postponed because you had to keep functioning can be mourned. The desire that you denied because it conflicted with your false identity can be honored. The vulnerability that you armored against because you equated it with weakness can be experienced as the profound strength it actually is. This is shadow integration, and it is only possible in brokenness. When your defenses are intact, the shadow must remain hidden, because its emergence would threaten the carefully constructed identity you are maintaining. But when the defenses have collapsed, when the false identity has shattered, there is nothing left to protect. The shadow can emerge not as enemy but as lost fragments of yourself, returning home. And these fragments carry extraordinary energy. The rage you suppressed is not just anger. It is your capacity for clear boundaries, your authentic sense of when something is genuinely wrong, your ability to say no with conviction. The grief you postponed is not just sadness. It is your capacity for genuine feeling, your connection to what matters, your acknowledgement of loss as the measure of love. The desire you denied is not just want. It is your passion, your life force, your authentic engagement with what calls to you. The vulnerability you armored against is not just weakness. It is your capacity for genuine intimacy, your ability to be met as you actually are rather than as you pretend to be. As you reclaim these shadow fragments, you begin to experience something that the defended ego could never access: wholeness. Not the performed wholeness of having it all together, but the authentic wholeness of integration. You are no longer divided against yourself. You are no longer at war with parts of your own being. You are no longer maintaining a false unity through the suppression of everything that does not fit the acceptable image. The alchemists understood this progression with remarkable precision. The nigredo, the blackening, the complete dissolution, naturally gives way to the albedo, the whitening, the clarity that emerges when illusions fall away. In psychological terms, this is the moment when you can finally see clearly, because you are no longer seeing through the distorting lens of your defenses. Reality becomes visible. Your own depths become accessible. The truth of your experience, no longer filtered through the persona's performance, arrives with devastating clarity. And this clarity, while often painful, is also profoundly liberating. You see how much energy you were spending maintaining the false self. You see how many of your relationships were built on mutual performance rather than genuine meeting. You see how your success was often measured by standards that had nothing to do with your authentic values. You see how much of your life was organized around avoiding exactly this moment of genuine encounter with yourself. But you also see, perhaps for the first time, what you actually care about beneath the conditioning. You see what genuinely moves you when you are not performing what should move you. You see who you actually are when you are not busy being who you were taught to be. And this authentic self is not a fixed essence waiting to be discovered. It is something that emerges through the very process of integration you are undergoing. This is the transcendent function at work, Jung's term for the psyche's natural capacity to integrate opposites and move toward wholeness. In brokenness, this function activates with new intensity. You begin to hold paradoxes that would have seemed impossible from within the defended ego. You are strong and vulnerable. You are capable and limited. You have agency and you recognize forces beyond your control. You can be authentic and compassionate toward others who are still defending. You can honor your needs and respect your constraints. These paradoxes do not cancel each other out. They integrate into a more complex, more nuanced, more truthful understanding of yourself and your place in the world. The defended ego demanded simplification. You were either strong or weak, either capable or incapable, either worthy or unworthy. But the self, emerging through integration, embraces complexity. You are all of these things, and the wholeness lies not in choosing one pole over the other, but in consciously holding the tension between them. And as this integration deepens, something emerges that you could not have anticipated from within the fortress. Authentic identity, not the identity you constructed to survive, but the identity that emerges when you stop constructing and start integrating. This is not about finding some hidden essence. It is about becoming yourself through the conscious engagement with everything you have been and everything you are becoming. You discover desires you did not know you had because they were buried beneath what you were supposed to want. You find capacities that were dormant because they did not fit the role you were performing. You encounter limitations that are actually liberating because they free you from the exhausting pretense of limitlessness. You meet needs that were denied for so long that acknowledging them feels revolutionary. This is the rubedo in alchemical terms, the reddening, the return of authentic vitality, the blood flowing again through a life that had become anemic through defense and performance. You are not returning to innocence. You cannot unknow what you have learned. But you are returning to a kind of immediacy, a direct engagement with your own experience that the defended ego made impossible. And the paradox becomes clear. Through brokenness has come genuine strength, not the false strength of the defended ego, maintained through control and denial and the suppression of anything that threatened it, but the real strength of the integrated person, someone who knows their capacity and their limitation, their power and their vulnerability, their desire and their constraint. This strength does not need to be defended because it is not based on the denial of weakness. It encompasses weakness. It integrates vulnerability. It is whole, not because it has eliminated the difficult parts, but because it has included them. You begin to move through the world differently. You are no longer performing for an invisible audience. You are no longer maintaining a persona. You are no longer at war with yourself. And this changes everything about how you relate to others. A person who has been genuinely broken and integrated can meet other people with actual presence because they are no longer using relationships to shore up a false identity. They are no longer seeking in connection what can only be found through integration. They can be intimate because intimacy no longer threatens them. There is no defended fortress to breach, no false self to expose. This does not mean the end of struggle. Integration is not a destination but an ongoing process. You will encounter new shadow material. You will find yourself defending again, performing again, retreating into old patterns when the new consciousness becomes too demanding. But something fundamental has shifted. You know now what it feels like to be broken open. You know what emerges when defenses fall, and you know that the light you encountered in the ruins was not a stranger coming to save you, but your own deepest self, finally visible. The myths remember this pattern because it is archetypal, woven into the fabric of genuine transformation. Osiris, dismembered and scattered, is gathered and made whole, not the same as before, but renewed, transformed into the Lord of the underworld, the one who has died and therefore can guide others through death. Dionysus, torn apart by Maenads, is reborn with even greater power, the god who dies and resurrects, who knows both ecstasy and devastation. Inanna returns from the underworld stripped of her regalia, but possessing a knowledge that only descent could teach. She is no longer the naive queen, but the one who has touched the deepest darkness and returned. These are not ancient stories, they are your story. The breaking you have undergone, the shattering that seemed to end you, the collapse that felt like annihilation. This was your initiation into deeper consciousness. This was the universe refusing to let you waste your one irreplaceable life, maintaining a monument to who you were taught to be. This was the self, asserting its claim, demanding authentic becoming even at the cost of everything the ego held dear. And now, in the aftermath, you understand what was always true but could not be seen from within the fortress. The breaking was not punishment, it was precision. The shattering was not cruelty, it was care. The devastation was not destruction, it was revelation. The universe broke you because you mattered too much to remain forever hidden behind walls of your own construction. The light that floods through the cracks is the light you have always been. The self that emerges in brokenness is the self that was always present, waiting only for the ego's defenses to fall so it could finally be perceived. The wholeness you encounter in the ruins is not something you achieved. It is something you finally stopped preventing. You are not who you were before the breaking. That person is dead, and they needed to die. But you are not diminished. You are more yourself than you have ever been, more complex, more contradictory, more vulnerable, more powerful, more authentic, more whole. The fortress kept you small. The breaking made you vast. The defenses kept you safe. The shattering made you real. And you understand now, with a clarity that could only come through complete dissolution and conscious reintegration, why the universe waited until you were broken to show you light. Because the light was never absent. You were just standing in your own shadow, mistaking the darkness you created for the nature of reality itself. The breaking moved you out of your own way. The shattering removed the obstacles. The devastation cleared the space where genuine consciousness could finally emerge. This is not the end of your journey. It is in many ways just the beginning, the first genuine beginning, the first moment when you are moving from your actual center rather than from the defended periphery. There will be more breaking, more integration, more cycling through dissolution and renewal, but you are no longer afraid of it. You know now what brokenness makes possible. You know what waits in the ruins. You know that the light was always there, always yours, always calling you home to yourself. The universe broke you to reveal you, and in that revelation, terrible and tender, devastating and sacred, you have finally begun to see what was always true. You are the light that floods through the cracks. You always were, because its emergence would threaten the carefully constructed identity you are maintaining. But when the defenses have collapsed, when the false identity has shattered, there is nothing left to protect. The shadow can emerge not as enemy but as lost fragments of yourself, returning home. And these fragments carry extraordinary energy. The rage you suppressed is not just anger. It is your capacity for clear boundaries, your authentic sense of when something is genuinely wrong, your ability to say no with conviction. The grief you postponed is not just sadness. It is your capacity for genuine feeling, your connection to what matters, your acknowledgement of loss as the measure of love. The desire you denied is not just want. It is your passion, your life force, your authentic engagement with what calls to you. The vulnerability you armored against is not just weakness. It is your capacity for genuine intimacy, your ability to be met as you actually are rather than as you pretend to be. As you reclaim these shadow fragments, you begin to experience something that the defended ego could never access: wholeness. Not the performed wholeness of having it all together, but the authentic wholeness of integration. You are no longer divided against yourself. You are no longer at war with parts of your own being. You are no longer maintaining a false unity through the suppression of everything that does not fit the acceptable image. The alchemists understood this progression with remarkable precision. The nigredo, the blackening, the complete dissolution, naturally gives way to the albedo, the whitening, the clarity that emerges when illusions fall away. In psychological terms, this is the moment when you can finally see clearly, because you are no longer seeing through the distorting lens of your defenses. Reality becomes visible. Your own depths become accessible. The truth of your experience, no longer filtered through the persona's performance, arrives with devastating clarity. And this clarity, while often painful, is also profoundly liberating. You see how much energy you were spending maintaining the false self. You see how many of your relationships were built on mutual performance rather than genuine meeting. You see how your success was often measured by standards that had nothing to do with your authentic values. You see how much of your life was organized around avoiding exactly this moment of genuine encounter with yourself. But you also see, perhaps for the first time, what you actually care about beneath the conditioning. You see what genuinely moves you when you are not performing what should move you. You see who you actually are when you are not busy being who you were taught to be. And this authentic self is not a fixed essence waiting to be discovered. It is something that emerges through the very process of integration you are undergoing. This is the transcendent function at work, Jung's term for the psyche's natural capacity to integrate opposites and move toward wholeness. In brokenness, this function activates with new intensity. You begin to hold paradoxes that would have seemed impossible from within the defended ego. You are strong and vulnerable. You are capable and limited. You have agency and you recognize forces beyond your control. You can be authentic and compassionate toward others who are still defending. You can honor your needs and respect your constraints. These paradoxes do not cancel each other out. They integrate into a more complex, more nuanced, more truthful understanding of yourself and your place in the world. The defended ego demanded simplification. You were either strong or weak, either capable or incapable, either worthy or unworthy. But the self, emerging through integration, embraces complexity. You are all of these things, and the wholeness lies not in choosing one pole over the other, but in consciously holding the tension between them. And as this integration deepens, something emerges that you could not have anticipated from within the fortress. Authentic identity, not the identity you constructed to survive, but the identity that emerges when you stop constructing and start integrating. This is not about finding some hidden essence. It is about becoming yourself through the conscious engagement with everything you have been and everything you are becoming. You discover desires you did not know you had because they were buried beneath what you were supposed to want. You find capacities that were dormant because they did not fit the role you were performing. You encounter limitations that are actually liberating because they free you from the exhausting pretense of limitlessness. You meet needs that were denied for so long that acknowledging them feels revolutionary. This is the rubedo in alchemical terms, the reddening, the return of authentic vitality, the blood flowing again through a life that had become anemic through defense and performance. You are not returning to innocence. You cannot unknow what you have learned. But you are returning to a kind of immediacy, a direct engagement with your own experience that the defended ego made impossible. And the paradox becomes clear. Through brokenness has come genuine strength, not the false strength of the defended ego, maintained through control and denial and the suppression of anything that threatened it, but the real strength of the integrated person, someone who knows their capacity and their limitation, their power and their vulnerability, their desire and their constraint. This strength does not need to be defended because it is not based on the denial of weakness. It encompasses weakness. It integrates vulnerability. It is whole, not because it has eliminated the difficult parts, but because it has included them. You begin to move through the world differently. You are no longer performing for an invisible audience. You are no longer maintaining a persona. You are no longer at war with yourself. And this changes everything about how you relate to others. A person who has been genuinely broken and integrated can meet other people with actual presence because they are no longer using relationships to shore up a false identity. They are no longer seeking in connection what can only be found through integration. They can be intimate because intimacy no longer threatens them. There is no defended fortress to breach, no false self to expose. This does not mean the end of struggle. Integration is not a destination, but an ongoing process. You will encounter new shadow material. You will find yourself defending again, performing again, retreating into old patterns when the new consciousness becomes too demanding. But something fundamental has shifted. You know now what it feels like to be broken open. You know what emerges when defenses fall, and you know that the light you encountered in the ruins was not a stranger coming to save you, but your own deepest self, finally visible. The myths remember this pattern because it is archetypal, woven into the fabric of genuine transformation. Osiris, dismembered and scattered, is gathered and made whole, not the same as before, but renewed, transformed into the Lord of the underworld, the one who has died and therefore can guide others through death. Dionysus, torn apart by Maenads, is reborn with even greater power, the god who dies and resurrects, who knows both ecstasy and devastation. Inanna returns from the underworld stripped of her regalia, but possessing a knowledge that only descent could teach. She is no longer the naive queen, but the one who has touched the deepest darkness and returned. These are not ancient stories, they are your story, the breaking you have undergone, the shattering that seemed to end you, the collapse that felt like annihilation. This was your initiation into deeper consciousness. This was the universe refusing to let you waste your one irreplaceable life, maintaining a monument to who you were taught to be. This was